So let's say you found a skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here, with a look at Dan Biddle. You might or might not remember, but Biddle is the jerk behind Genesis Apologetics. Now, normally I wouldn't start a series of videos with such an epithet, as it poisons the well a bit. But here's the thing. Genesis Apologetics, through a proxy, has been fraudulently copyright claiming fair use of their material, not just by me, but also by Gutsit Gibbon, Vice Rhino, Godless Engineer, and Paulogia. As far as I'm concerned, that makes them jerks. Anyway, this rather low-quality video is a speech that Dan Biddle gave recently in which he says he can bring down the 10 pillars of evolution. I'm sure most of you are as surprised as I was to learn that evolution even had 10 particular pillars. But hey, who said you can't learn anything from creationists? Oh, right. Basically every scientist out there. Oh well, that's what this channel is about. Debunking nonsense. While I hopefully teach you guys something about real science while I'm at it. Anyway, without further ado, take it away, Danny boy.
Okay, so a lot of teenagers today, because you're getting crammed full of 250 pages of evolution teaching, but they have experiences with Christ, they love singing worship, they believe Christ is real, they're Christians. But when they graduate from high school, in order to try to weave and bend the evidence for evolution into their Christian worldview, they adopt theistic evolution. They believe that God created over the process of evolution over millions of years because it's their way to try to integrate the two.
And they have that in common with the vast majority of Christians. And the simple reason is that evolution is a much firmer conclusion than Christianity. I'm not here to tell you what religion to follow, but I am here to say that whatever religion you follow, if it isn't compatible with science, you've got the wrong one. Science is objectively verifiable, and subject to repeated testing and open to falsification. Yet the current leading ideas in science have yet to be falsified, despite decades and even centuries of testing in some cases. It's a simple fact that no religious idea is on the same level of footing. This isn't necessarily a problem. Much we believe in our everyday life isn't really open to that level of confidence. But still, if your theology comes first and the science second, then sorry, but your theology is almost certainly wrong. If you put science first, then your theology at least could be right.
But there's a problem with that because the special creation says that God started with the earth. Evolution said it started with the Big Bang.
Dan says this is a problem, but he's talking about theistic evolutionists, who unlike biblical literalist young earth creationists, aren't required to take the order of the Genesis account as a literal history. They can take it as the myth it is, and not have to interpret it literally. And that doesn't make it false either, because the truth of myths isn't about their literal accuracy as to the past, it's about the lessons you take from them about yourself and the world around you.
The creation order on day 2, there was water before land. Well, evolution has it the other way around, totally opposite.
Well, that's because the planet formed from accretion, and as things accrete, all their potential orbital energy gets converted into thermal energy, so planets tend to start off very, very hot. Additionally, there were more internal radioactive atoms on Earth, so the flux of radiation from Earth's interior was higher, and when radiation gets absorbed into a planet, that energy gets turned into thermal energy. You know, that whole conservation of energy thing? That also means that especially at first, Earth would have been extremely hot and screamingly radioactive. Not exactly the kind of place you'd get lots of oceans.
Day 3, you've got first life on dry land. Well, evolution says life evolved in the water.
See, this is because up until after the Cambrian, we have both land and water deposits in the sedimentary rocks of the geological record. But the only fossils we see are marine fossils. I think creationists kind of forget that we have terrestrial deposits from the Cambrian and Precambrian. Fact is, though, we do. And they don't show signs of life. Plus, being aquatic is plesiomorphic for basically every animal phylum. So we have good reason to think all extant animals originated from aquatic ancestors.
A little bit different. Sun, moon, and stars are created after the Earth, and then here in evolution, the stars and galaxies were formed before the Earth and the planets.
Well, yeah, the heavier elements require at least population 0 stars to go supernova to even exist, and to exist in any significant abundance, you're going to have to wait until higher metallicity stars occur, like population 1 or population 2. For those who aren't really familiar with these terms, let me explain. The makeup of a star is measured, at least in one way, by astronomers using a metric called metallicity. Now, mostly because they like being abstruse, astronomers, when talking about stars, call any element heavier than helium a metal, so from lithium on up. The Big Bang produced, at least as far as normal matter is concerned, almost all hydrogen with a bit of helium. As a result, the first stars had an extremely low metallicity, as there were essentially no elements besides hydrogen and helium to go into their makeup. But as we know, heavier elements up to iron are created in the cores of main sequence stars as they end their lives and explode into planetary nebulae, which have at their cores white dwarfs, neutron stars, or black holes. But this only spreads mostly elements up to iron, and a bit heavier in the case of supernovas, resulting in neutron stars or black holes. Most of the atoms heavier than iron are made in a different kind of supernova, called a Type 1a supernova. These supernovae are the result of a different kind of supernova, called Type 1a supernova. These supernovae are the result of a binary star system in which one of the companions is a white dwarf. Close orbiting white dwarfs will tend to siphon material from their companion star's atmosphere, which will then fall onto the surface of the white dwarf. Of course, this raises the mass of the white dwarf, and when it is close to what is called the Chandrasekhar limit, which is the mass at which the structure can no longer hold its own weight as normal matter, and if it were to get heavier, it would collapse into a neutron star held up by the Pauli exclusion principle, it will hit the energy required for iron fusion, which will then, in a fraction of a second, fuse essentially all of the accreted material into heavier elements and throw them off in a characteristic explosion that has a consistent brightness, and which sees the surrounding space with a virtual menagerie of heavy elements. As a side note, the consistent brightness of these supernovae allow them to be used as measures of distance to distant galaxies in which they observed, making them one of our best standard candles. Anyway, it took some Type 1 supernovae from pop-zero, low metallicity stars to get to the point where we could even have enough heavy elements to form a planet, so stars and galaxies logically had to precede a planet like Earth, since Earth is essentially made out of the detritus of dead stars.
Day 5, you've got birds before dinosaurs. Well, evolution says dinosaurs became birds.
Well, one lineage became birds, the rest died out. It's not like all dinosaurs gradually evolved into becoming birds independently. That would actually go a long way to falsifying evolution if it had occurred. But why does science conclude that birds evolved from dinosaurs? Because birds meet every anatomical definition of dinosaurs. See the videos linked above and in the description for a more in-depth dive. But further, birds evolved in the Middle Jurassic, depending on exactly how you want to define bird. And the first dinosaurs we have on record come from the late Triassic. So yeah, we know for a fact that birds came after the first dinosaurs, for the same reason we know your great-grandparents were born before your first cousins.
And by the way, that's a relatively new idea. I certainly never heard about that when I was...
Not really. It was floated as an idea during Darwin's time, and in fact Archaeopteryx was initially heralded by much of the scientific community as the link between birds and dinosaurs. It was to a large degree Richard Owen's attempts to dismiss the idea that made it lose favor for a while, but with the discovery of dinosaurs like Deinonychus, it was once again brought into the limelight, and with repeated new finds that do nothing but support the hypothesis that birds are dinosaurs and fail to support the null hypothesis that they are anything else, there is at this point no longer any reason to doubt that birds are dinosaurs, no matter what hacks like Alan Fiducia, who have taken themselves outside the bounds of science, might like to say.
But now when you go to these big dinosaur shows all over the place, they're sticking feathers on every dinosaur every which way all over the place. So they basically turn them into large talking chickens there. So,
other than parrots and sometimes ravens and crows, I'm not really aware of any popular depictions of dinosaurs that aren't overly anthropomorphic, such as, in The Land Before Time, talking. But whatever, let's focus on feathers. First, I want to explain a technique in reconstructing extinct taxa called phylogenetic bracketing. So in this you see which characteristics are most widely distributed in a group of organisms. Let's take mammals, for example. You find fur in monotremes, marsupials, and placental mammals, and only the occasional exception within that group, such as elephants, Whippomorpha, naked mole rats, and to some degree humans. So if you find a new fossil mammal, the safe bet is that it has fur, as it is the basal and most widespread trait in the group of organisms to which it belongs. But what if the animal is in fact a fossil cetacean? Well, now you have to see where it falls. All modern cetaceans lack any appreciable fur, so if it is within crowned cetaceans, that is, it is more closely related to some living cetacean than to another living cetacean, it makes sense to not reconstruct it with fur. Whereas if it is basal to modern cetaceans, you have to consider its habitat and lifestyle, because we know that some basal whippomorph-like animals must have had fur, as fur is the basal trait for mammals. So now we can see how this applies to feathers and dinosaurs. There are some 50 plus dinosaur genera for which direct evidence of feathers is known. This list is always growing as new discoveries are being made. Now, we know from skeletal evidence that animals in Deinonychosauria, for example, are closer to birds than they are to other dinosaurs like ornithomimids, and we have direct evidence that birds have feathers, and that some Deinonychosaurs did too, such as Maniraptor gui and Velociraptor, which have been found with feather impressions and quill knobs respectively. So let's say we have a taxon that is phylogenetically within the group that includes Deinonychosauria and aves, that is, paravians. Let's say it's Troodon, and we don't have any direct evidence that it was feathered. Well, since feathers appear to be the basal condition in paraves, and this is a paravian dinosaur, the most likely option is that Troodon was covered in feathers. And as it turns out, feathers and related structures are basically ubiquitous throughout Dinosauria to various degrees, but might even be common to Ornithodiro, the group that includes pterosaurs, dinosaurs, and their most recent common ancestor and all of its descendants. Now, these are not always feathers the way you think of them. For example, most ornithischian feathers, like those of Psittacosaurus or Collinodromius, were not much like those of modern birds, but they still share some key features with them that make us call them protofeathers.
And then on day 6, we've got man created in God's image from dust. And in evolution, man is made in animal likeness from ape-like creatures. So the Bible says we're made in the image of God, not in the image of apes.
Well, humans are definitely multicellular eukaryotes with an internal digestive tract, and they also have other features unique to animals, like being held together largely with collagen. So humans are certainly animals no matter how they came about. So if we're talking about the physical form of humans, then the question is why the eternal pre-existing creator of the world is an animal. Could it be perhaps that the Imago Dei is more of a matter of reasoning, creative capacity, and moral agency than it is that God happens to be a sweaty bald monkey? I don't know, just food for thought. But speaking of sweaty bald monkeys, before we continue, I'd like to take a moment to thank my patrons and channel members. I just want to take a second to thank my channel members and patrons, especially those pledging $20 and above. Bob Knob, Benthoven, Ian Chen, Chris Love, Sphincter of Doom, The Venerable Bede, Patrick Dennis, and Res Instance. My channel members and patrons help make this channel possible, and without their support, this channel really wouldn't exist. If you would like to help support the channel as a member or patron, there are links in the description to both join the channel as well as join the Patreon. Patrons and members get mentioned in these credit scenes, as well as getting early access to my scripted videos, and if you pledge $10 or above, you can also get access to various 3D assets that I create for Blender, both for use in the channel, as well as just general giveaways to my supporters to help in any Blender projects they might have. If a monthly or annual pledge isn't for you, then there is also a merch store linked to the description, and if none of that's right for you, please just like and subscribe because every like and subscription really helps the video out. Thank you.
So this is the poison that the kids are adopting. And then they get to the creation account and they're like, well, that must be myth and fairy tale. And if that's myth and fairy tale...
Well, it's a myth because it exists to give people a context for their relationship to God, nature, and each other. But it does that regardless of its literal truth. The point of myths isn't that they happened, it's that they tell us something about ourselves and our world that isn't dependent on historical accuracy. It's kind of like a fable or a parable. In Jesus' parable of the rich man and Lazarus, it's not important if the rich man is a real person, and he almost certainly was not. Similarly, in the story of the scorpion and the frog, the fact that we know that frogs and scorpions don't talk, never mind to each other, isn't important. Both stories have a lesson to give us. So does the creation myth of Genesis. Now, I'm not going to tell you if you should accept that lesson, but it's clearly there no matter how you take the historicity of the story.
Why do I need to submit to anything else the Bible says?
You don't, I guess. At least not if you don't want to. But if you do, the idea that the whole collection of separate works depends on the literal truth of one section of one book that doesn't even have a single author seems a bit odd to me as someone with training in the historical method.
So let's look at teaching in evolution, the evolution teaching in school. So this talk is titled Debunking the 10 Pillars of Evolution, but it's really modeled over the template of the evolution that's taught in public schools.
So I guess these aren't really pillars of evolution then. That's a bit too bad. But then again, I do get the idea of using the parts of evolution that are most commonly taught in order to criticize it to a lay audience.
So if you were to take all the public school textbooks that talk about evolution, they're going to boil it down to these 10 things.
It's been a while since I was in grade school, but I sure hope the public education isn't so wanting in schools that they boil evolution down into just 10 things. Evolution is a body of knowledge over a century old, with tens of thousands at least of supporting studies, papers, etc. 10 points would be a severe paucity in terms of the evidence for evolution.
Deep time, which is the foundation for their whole theory. It all requires deep time. Then they've got human evolution.
I mean, human evolution is a neat example, but even if we only had extant apes and no fossils, it would be a certainty. Or as close to one as science gets. But it's not like if we didn't know anything about human evolution, we would give up evolution as a whole. It's far too well evidenced for that.
Adaptation, natural selection, fossils.
I mean, fossils, as much as I love them, are the icing on the cake. The morphology and genetics of just extant species is enough to conclusively dismiss special creation. simply because of the twin-nested hierarchy, which demonstrates quite conclusively that there is common ancestry. This is because human-made objects don't fall into objectively nested hierarchies, because designers can swap out parts. For example, the lug nuts from two different makes of cars with different designers may fit both cars. This is because the lug nuts are a standard part that can be swapped out entirely without any ancestry. On a more extreme scale, you could power two entirely different vehicles from the same combustion engine, a propeller plane and a car, for example. In Descent with Modification, the entire organism is modified, and so each new clade contains adaptations and changes which are unique to it in all of the animal kingdom. That is why, to cite a famous example, despite the fact that 4 lineages have developed powered flight, that is, insects, pterosaurs, bats, and birds, their wings are all different. A common designer can mix and match parts. He could make a chimera, as human designers can and do. In fact, it's easy to see that a chimera would in many cases perform better. For example, bats benefit from the keen hearing of mammals, but would do even better with the keeled sternum and lungs of birds, yet they lack them, because they're stuck with what evolution gave them, mammal bodies through and through. The fact that genetics follows essentially the same pattern of nesting that anatomy does, even in neutral variation, is confirmation that takes the statistical significance of this matter beyond any reasonable doubt. There is no reason besides common ancestry for even the neutral variation between organisms to fall into the same nested pattern as morphology of those organisms.
Common ancestors, homological structures, vestigial structures, or leftover structures.
I mean, the fact that these exist at all is really only explained by evolution, so I guess I might call these pillars of evolution, especially common ancestors, since one of the main ideas in evolution is common ancestry, and conveniently, we know that groups of organisms have common ancestors.
Whale evolution.
Whale evolution, like human evolution, is more of a nice example than a pillar. It's kind of like saying that the orbit of Jupiter is a pillar of Kepler's laws of planetary motion. By itself, it's more of an illustrative example. It's the broad accuracy of the laws across virtually all orbiting bodies that is the basis for accepting them as general rules, although they do break down at certain scales, and you have to use Einstein instead of Kepler. Similarly, evolution in no way rests in particular on whales. It's just that we have a nice series of fossils and genetics to back it up. So we have a really clear picture of their evolution when compared to some other groups.
And extinction.
Excuse me, the did you just say?
Extinction isn't a pillar of evolution. It's not even really required in order for evolution to work. It's just a fact of the world, and so our accounts of the history of life take it into account.
These are really the 10 pillars that the kids are getting inundated with today. It used to be starting in 5th grade, now they've rolled it back to 3rd grade, so they're starting even earlier.
Good. It's never too early for kids to get exposed to science, as long as the content is tailored to their age. And I'm sorry, but the fact that his particular version of Christianity is contradicted by basic reality isn't a good reason to not expose kids to reality. When your religion is on the same footing as Flat Earth, I have no desire to pander to it or the feelings of its adherents. Get a better theology, and quit whining that kids are taught science.
Let's deal with the first pillar, the age of the Earth and radiometric dating. So you've got to ask yourself the question, why does the world push millions of years? Well, the answer is pretty simple.
The world isn't pushing millions of years any more than it's pushing the germ theory of disease, universal gravitation, the heliocentric solar system, atomic theory, cellular theory, or the globe-shaped Earth. It's just that when you want to take reality seriously, you have to take the evidence as it presents itself, and it is conclusive that the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. It's not an agenda, it's just the conclusion of science. The fact that Dan Biddle doesn't like it doesn't make it a conspiracy to make him lose his faith.
Because there's this doctrine that fundamental Christians hold to called special creation.
Nope, science is not done to contradict some theological position. Creationism basically doesn't come up in science except in a few papers that occasionally exist basically to poke fun at how absurd it is. The serious work of science continues on, barely even aware that creationists still exist. In fact, often completely unaware of them. And that's because they are as relevant to science as alchemists are to chemistry, or astrologers are to astronomy. They are a quaint historical curiosity, and the fact that they still exist is likely to elicit little more than a bemused chuckle from actual working scientists. The fact that science contradicts special creation isn't a matter of malice or conspiracy. It's simply the fact of the matter.
Which means, in fact, I was just at a church recently, and I asked all the kids, I said, how did God create? What were the mechanisms that God used? And it was crickets. Nobody knew.
That's a fair response, since we didn't really get a mechanism that can be described in any scientific way from the Bible.
The mechanism is really simple. He spoke it. over and over and over again. And there was light, there was evening, morning, day 2, and then God said, and then God said, and then God said. And all through Psalms and Isaiah, it talks about God commanded and it stood firm.
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard. At no point in your rambling, incoherent response were you even close to anything that could be considered a rational thought. Everyone in this room is now dumber for having listened to it. I award you no points, and may God have mercy on your soul.
Speaking isn't a mechanism. Because, one, before air, how did God speak anything? So even if we take the story literally, it had to be a metaphor when he speaks. Second, we know that speaking doesn't affect creation. So we had to be actually literally doing something more than just speaking. This is the problem with literalism. It leads to contradictions even within a basic text that you just don't have to assume are there. You can just let the narrative have its allegory and metaphor, and at least then it's internally consistent for the most part. Or you can be Dan Biddle and take the worst possible take on it and make the whole thing fall apart on verse 3.
So if you don't want to agree in the special creation that God miraculously spoke into existence, you got to have something stretched out over millions and millions of years so it could come into place randomly.
Well, that's a false dichotomy if I ever heard one. Either it's literal speech, which is impossible, or it's randomness over a long term, which isn't even what science says. It's a false dichotomy where both options are nonsense. That's one for the record books. At least most false dichotomies are between two things that are somewhat internally consistent.
So over and over the place, you look on TV, you go to natural history museums, you can't even take a bike ride around Lake Turkana without seeing signs of millions of years.
It's in movies, it's on TV. You can't even take a look at a map without seeing signs of the round Earth. Yeah, there's a reason for that. It's because the big difference between believing in a young Earth and a flat Earth is just how long we've known you're wrong. There's still no conspiracy against the young or the flat Earth. It's just people going about their business accepting the obvious nature of reality that is glaringly clear to all but the duped or deliberately ignorant. And if you're a creationist, you're either misinformed, dishonest, or both.
It's everywhere. Kids are steeped with it.
Yeah, just like they're steeped in universal gravitation. No one is going to make a show that pretends that gravity just doesn't work in general, because everyone would have trouble taking it seriously. The fact that some small, misinformed segment of the population doesn't like that isn't going to change it.
And they know that it has to be fundamental to the idea of evolution. Here's a clip from a high school biology book that says this. Evolution takes a long time. If life has evolved, then Earth must be very old. Hutton and Lyell, which were two geologists of the 1800s, argued that Earth was indeed very old. But, interesting, did you know that these guys said that they wanted to free geology from Moses?
First, that's an ad hominem argument. Don't trust these guys because they said a naughty thing about Moses. Guess what? If they had said that they wanted to burn all the Bibles and sacrifice babies to the ancient Earth by throwing them in volcanoes, and then they wanted to eat all of the Christians, that wouldn't make them wrong. Second, who cares what Hutton and Lyell thought? They are of significance to the history of science, but no longer to the science itself. Science isn't about great profits the way religion often is. The words of Hutton and Lyell aren't sacred. They are simply the first to spread certain ideas which turned out to be broadly correct. And so we remember their names.
That was their goal. They wanted to take geology out of the context from Moses and the genealogy and free it up to the idea of uniformitarianism or deep time.
They sure did, but if they had been wrong about deep time, they wouldn't have been able to win the fight. Turns out, they were right, and the Earth is old. And so they did free geology from pretending that rocks of the Earth were largely the result of the flood, and then just not bothering to look more into it. Hooray for Hutton and Lyell.
So he goes on and says that they argued that the Earth was indeed very old, but technology in their day couldn't determine just how old. Half a century after Darwin published his theory, however, physicists discovered radioactivity. Geologists now use radioactivity to establish the age of certain rocks and fossils. This kind of data could have shown that Earth is young. If that had happened, Darwin's ideas would have been refuted and abandoned.
It's almost like there wasn't some sinister conspiracy to prove Darwin correct.
So the battle line is drawn. So, these are all 10. let me see, this is just 4 of the books that talk about biology. These books are 1,000 pages long. Most of them include 150 pages of evolution teaching. 1/8 of these textbooks deal with evolution. So these kids are just getting drowned in it, lots and lots. So
I would argue that's far too little. Now, not every page should be exclusively concerned with evolutionary mechanisms, but evolution should be on every page of a biology text. To a certain extent, evolution is biology. Missing it out would be like trying to talk about the weather and not bothering with humidity or barometric pressure. Sure, I guess you could talk about the weather without those two, but if you're trying to teach people about it, they're kind of important. Similarly, evolution is a unifying theory in biology. As Theodosius Dobzhansky, a Christian mind you, once said, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution."
these things, all these things, what do they have in common? Things like children's books, dinosaur shows, public camp retreats, college professors, peers, family members, nature trails, state parks, museums, public school, television, and movies. In fact, I someday try to see if I can just go a day without seeing Millions of Years somewhere. You turn on the History Channel, it's there, Nova, you go watch movies today. The kids are being steeped in this idea of millions of years. But the Bible presents a much different history because who existed before Adam? Nobody. There was no population of apes that God plucked and said, well, this ape looks cute. I think I'll turn him into a human. It did not happen. We have the family of Adam from Genesis 5, and we know that Adam lived 130 years.
And so on and so forth. But this isn't evidence, it's the claim. A book says X isn't evidence for the claim. But if the book provides references, then the references might be evidence if they are reliable. Unfortunately, the Bible doesn't really have a reference section, so all its claims have to be checked externally. Now, some of them have turned out to be true, like there really does seem to have been a King David, and Pontius Pilate was a real guy too. Some of them haven't been verified or disconfirmed, like whether or not a guy named Ezekiel ever had a fire starting contest. And some, like special creation, have been shown to be false.
And the flood. So either this is inspired scripture and it happened, or it's not, because it's written like a history book.
It's not, though, because history books didn't really exist when it was written. At the time, instead, what we had were polemics using the past, whether the true past or not, to make claims. Often these were political claims, such as that King so-and-so of Akkad was the greatest ruler of all time and the chosen of the gods, or that the current dynasty of Egypt was eternal. But in the case of Genesis, the point was religious. It was to show that the God of the Hebrews was supreme over the world, the sole creator, and was more powerful than the pretender gods worshipped in Mesopotamia. It was also a myth to tell the Hebrews where they and other nations came from, and how they related to each other, and how the Hebrews should act towards both the natural world, that is, that they should be stewards of it, and towards other nations.
The first 11 chapters of Genesis have the birth years, lifespans, or death of 37 patriarchs. That's not allegory, it's not poetry, it's talking about real history. Here we line it all up. We spent about 5 minutes last night talking about the fact that these pre-flood patriarchs lived an average of 912 years.
Except that genealogies were often used in the ancient Near East as allegory. The numbers were often exaggerated and used more for numerology than for a sober historical account. This continues even into the New Testament, where Jesus' genealogy is given in multiples of 7, because in Jewish tradition, that number is numerologically significant.
Then they hit the flood, then their lifespans began systematically and exponentially declining, getting shorter and shorter lifespans. And that was all because there was a genetic bottleneck when you take only 8 people from this population of the human genome that had probably millions of people before the flood. You take it down to just 8, put all those 8 people on the ark.
The Bible starts with a bottleneck not of 8, but of 2. Further, the ark bottleneck is actually a bottleneck of 5, since 3 of the 8 people are brothers and all the sons of the same couple. This really isn't a scenario where the genetics work out for a literal interpretation of Genesis 1 through 11 being historical.
And their mutations due to inbreeding start exponentially increasing and people start living shorter and shorter lives. There's lots of science to support that.
No, there's not, because inbreeding doesn't cause mutations. It causes increased homozygosity. So let's talk about homozygosity versus heterozygosity. A gene is a distinct sequence of nucleotides forming part of a chromosome, the order of which determines the order of monomers in a polypeptide which a cell, or virus, may synthesize. Genes exist at loci, singular locus, which simply means a particular location on a particular chromosome. Now, two organisms may possess the same gene, but have different variations of it. These variations are called alleles. So it is not technically correct to say that you could have a blonde gene and someone else a brunette gene. If we simplify hair color down to a single gene for the purposes of illustration, you would be more correct to say that you have a blonde allele and someone else has a brunette allele, but you both have a hair color gene. Now we have to come to ploidy. Ploidy describes how many copies of the genome you have in your cells. Humans are diploid, meaning that they have two copies of their genome, one from the father and one from the mother. This is slightly modified in the case of the Y chromosome, which is not a full copy of the X chromosome, so if an egg is fertilized without an X chromosome, which can happen due to errors in the production of sperm and eggs, the resulting embryo is not viable, because many X-linked genes are vital. But other than this minor caveat, humans have two sets of 23 chromosomes each. Each chromosome can have the same or different alleles at any given locus. When each chromosome has the same allele, the individual is said to be homozygous for that allele. When the alleles on each chromosome are different, they are said to be heterozygous. Now, inbreeding occurs when mating happens in a small or genetically similar population, resulting in alleles falling out of the population due to genetic drift, and an increase in homozygosity at most loci in the genome within that population. But here's the problem. This doesn't cause an increased mutation rate, but if it did, then we wouldn't see inbreeding. You see, most English speakers connect inbreeding with incest, or mating within the family, but that's not actually what inbreeding is in the scientific sense. Inbreeding is about genetic diversity, not the family tree of a mating pair. If you have high mutation, you don't have inbreeding, because formerly homozygous loci will in the descendants once again become heterozygous. So Dan here is arguing from both sides of his mouth. Either the supposed decrease in lifespan is due to harmful alleles fixing due to inbreeding, or it's because of dangerous new mutations. But it can't be both, because they are opposite effects. Of course, it could also be, and in fact is, the case that these stories aren't actually literally true.
So, but where does the world get this idea of millions of years from? Well, they get it from radiometric dating.
Well, not entirely. We knew that the world was at least several million years old before we could confirm that by radiometric dating. What geologists and physicists noticed was that first, some rocks simply couldn't be the result of rapid deposition, and we had thick and extensive deposits of such rock. And we also had features like unconformities in paleolandscapes, all of which require time to form, and in some cases, a lot of it. Also, we knew that the Earth was hot, and eventually that it also produced heat from radiation. This told us that it must have taken some considerable time to cool to the point where it was habitable. Only later did radiometric dating come and give some hard numbers that we could hang our hats on.
You can take radioactive materials like uranium and see it decay into lead, or potassium into argon, and you take the parent isotope and see how fast it decays in today's atmosphere into a daughter isotope.
Real quick, nuclear decay is, as the name implies, a nuclear process. It occurs in the nuclei of atoms. Atomic nuclei are essentially incapable of interacting via chemistry and pressure. And unsurprisingly, it's basically impossible to vary the decay rate no matter the external conditions. There are a few exceptions, such as the ability to sustain fission given neutrons, which can be thermalized by certain substances, which is how humans manage to get their reactors going. But for basically all purposes except fission in a small number of isotopes of a few elements, nuclear decay is not something that can be changed by external factors.
But there's 4 assumptions that we can't go back and see and test or observe or repeat like real science would require to prove that this is good science, because it works today. It works really reliable and consistently. You'll get the same ratios or similar ratios when you look at these decay rates in a laboratory today.
Yep, and since we don't observe physics changing today, we assume it didn't change in the past. And further, since we can see distant starlight that came to us from a long time ago, we can check some aspects of physics, and as far as we can tell, they haven't changed in the past. So unless we're given extremely good reason to think that these decay rates even can vary significantly, we should not think that they can, as we have excellent reasons why they shouldn't be able to. And reasons to conclude that in fact, they have not.
But we don't know the starting amount of the parent isotope because we weren't there supposedly millions of years ago.
In fact, in many cases we do know the starting amount of the parent isotope, at least within a margin of error. And this is because in many cases the parent isotope is the one which is included chemically as an impurity in the crystals forming in what is to become igneous rock. But the daughter isotopes cannot form impurities in the original rock in the same way because, being different elements, they have different chemistry which would exclude them. Now, this isn't the case for every kind of radiometrically significant isotope, but we also have techniques to cross-check dates and check for contamination or leakage. For example, an isochron date is achieved by using several radiometric parent and daughter isotopes and checking their ratios on a plot. If the plot deviates too much from linear, we know that there is contamination or leakage from the rock, and it also happens to have the advantage of cancelling out the amount of parent isotope in the equations, so the actual original proportion doesn't matter. It's almost like scientists have thought about these assumptions and come up with ways to check them, or cancel them out, so that they're not problems. But nah, experts never bother trying to make their measurement techniques reliable.
We don't know the starting amount of the daughter isotope.
Everything I just said about parent isotopes works just as well for daughter isotopes.
We don't know the decay rate is the same back then as it was today.
As I've stated, changing the decay rate essentially means you have to change the constants that underlie all of nuclear physics. You have to break reality to make these vary by any significant degree. So, given that it's creationists who are suggesting that maybe physics doesn't work at all, I would suggest it's also on them to demonstrate that physics just kind of broke down a few thousand years ago. And as far as the rest of the world is concerned, we should carry on with physics as is, and to therefore conclude that yes, decay rates were the same in the past.
And we also don't know if the whole thing is in a closed system.
As I've said, we can tell with isochron dating, and most of the things like metamorphosis, which would make parent or daughter isotopes leach in or out of a rock, are things we can detect simply by studying the rocks in question. One group of people I don't need radiometric dating to appreciate are my channel members and patrons. So let's take a moment before we continue to thank them now. I just want to take a second to thank my channel members and patrons, especially those pledging $20 and above. Bob Knob, Benthoven, Ian Chen, Chris Love, Sphincter of Doom, The Venerable Bede, Patrick Dennis, and Res Instance. My channel members and patrons help make this channel possible, and without their support, this channel really wouldn't exist. If you would like to help support the channel as a member or patron, there are links in the description to both join the channel as well as join the Patreon. Patrons and members get mentioned in these credit scenes, as well as getting early access to my scripted videos, and if you pledge $10 or above, you can also get access to various 3D assets that I create for Blender, both for use in the channel, as well as just general giveaways to my supporters to help in any Blender projects they might have. If a monthly or annual pledge isn't for you, then there is also a merch store linked to the description, and if none of that's right for you, please just like and subscribe because every like and subscription really helps the video out. Thank you.
Which it would be required to be in a closed system for it to be repeatable and reliable for back in the distant past.
Here, Dan finally got something right.
So all kinds of assumptions go in to radiometric dating. So let's test their assumptions to see how well they work. This is Mount St. Helens up in Washington. Was anyone around when this thing blew its top? I was a teenager. The sky was dark for 3 days. It was filled with ash. It was an amazing experience to live through. So there's what it looks like when it blows its top. It spewed forth ash covering 3 or 4 western states.
Holy crap, this dude needs to get to a point and fast.
But that provided a great opportunity because you know what? We could then go back to the dacite rock that was birthed out of the lava dome that people watched and got to see form in the 1980s, grab that rock, take it into a laboratory, and test how old it is. We can test radiometric dating in real time, and if it was a 10-year-old rock, it should come back in a lab saying it's a 10-year-old rock.
Not really, it should come back with the actual age within the margin of error, supposing that the test is sufficiently sensitive. Just like you can't really use a yardstick to measure the width of a proton or the distance to the moon, you have to use tests that are designed for what you're trying to measure. So if you use, say, potassium-argon, which tends to return dates in the billions of years, with error margins in the tens of millions, you're not going to get a calendar year out of that test for a rock that's a few decades old.
Well, they did it in 5 different ways, cut it every which way possible, and these radiometric dating analyses shows that this rock that we knew was only 10 years old came back 2.8 million, 1.7 million, 900,000 years old, 340,000 years old. It was only actually 30 years, this particular sample.
So let's talk about the guy who did this study, Steve Austin, the $6 million man.
Steve Austin, astronaut, a man barely alive. Gentlemen, we can rebuild him. We have the technology. We have the capability to make the world's first bionic man.
Wait, no, wrong Steve Austin. Let's talk about Stone Cold Steve Austin. Darn, still not the right one. Okay, I got it. Let's talk about creationist Dr. Steve Austin, a confirmed hack fraud. Now, you might think it's a bit of a stretch to call the good doctor a hack fraud, but in fact, this study that Dan Biddle is talking about is why I'm calling him a hack fraud. So Austin took 5 samples to be potassium-argon dated from the Mount St. Helens deposit. He took them to a lab that only had basic equipment for such dating, namely the Geochron Laboratories in Cambridge, Massachusetts. They no longer do potassium-argon dating there, but at the time they did, they warned that they could not reliably date anything much younger than 2 million years. This means that essentially any date they gave that was 2 million years or under was essentially the same date and couldn't be distinguished from a date of 0 years. Interestingly enough, that's 4 out of the 5 dates. Let's go into why the dates are incorrect. With the relatively inexpensive machines that Cambridge was using, small amounts of argon remain in the test chambers because being a heavy inert gas, it's not easy to get all of it out of the place it has settled into. Higher end machines can, but these could only partially evacuate the argon from the test chambers. Now, for rocks of over 2 million years old, this small argon signal from residual argon of other tests isn't a big deal, and will tend to get lost in the instrument error. However, for very young samples, this residual signal is essentially the only argon signal the machine is likely to pick up. As a result, the machine will always give results with significant age from a few 100,000 years to about 2 million years old, because it is physically incapable of doing otherwise. So Dr. Austin either knowingly submitted samples to a test he knows can't be run on them reliably, or he's so incompetent that he can't even figure out the problem. So yeah, like I said, he's a hack fraud. But then what about the 2.8 million year test date? Which, by the way, had an error margin of 600,000 years. That was a sample of pyroxenes, and in the original write-up about this little experiment, Austin et al. Have pictures of the pyroxenes under the microscope. And it has little granules that Austin says were not older material, but were simply materials of the same age. However, he does not really justify that statement, and other geologists note that they are consistent with what are called xenocrysts, which are small inclusions of significantly older crystal. Such contamination would give anomalously old readings. While Austin simply dismisses this possibility, real scientists have no such luxury. So essentially, in the one date that even could be valid, we have good reason to think that there is contamination from much older rock. Overall then, this study says more about Austin's honesty and ability to do science than it does about radiometric dating.
So all 5 studies shows that a 30-year-old rock goes back and it's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years old.
Yep, just like if you were to try to measure a proton with a ruler marked in millimeters, you're probably going to get the wrong result. If you do use the wrong machine and techniques to date rock, you'll get the wrong result. I'm not sure if Dan thinks this is supposed to be some kind of revelation or what.
This happens all the time. I was in an online debate once with a geologist, and he was saying, Dr. Biddle, it's crazy you believe this fairy tale, stuff about Genesis and the genealogies, because we know radiometric dating is true. And I said, okay, that's great. I said, do you know of any studies of radiometric dating where they've taken the radiometric age of a rock into a lab and it validates to the known age of the rock?
Again, Dan prattles on for far too long. But let's see. He wants a radiometric study that confirms the historical age of a volcanic eruption. Okay, how about the 1997 paper, Argon Dating into the Historical Realm, Calibration Against Pliny the Younger, by P.R. Rene, W.D. Sharp, A.L. Dano, G. Orsi, and L. Civita, which got the age of the volcanic eruption correct with a margin of under a year, as compared to the historical events and dating provided by Pliny the Younger, who lost family in the eruption. I think that's pretty good, and exactly what the doctor asked for. As a result, I'm going to skip the rest of his rambling anecdote in which his debate partner says that he can't provide such a reference. I suspect this debate is fictional.
Okay, so my daughter was taking an advanced history class, and I was having fun looking through her book with her. And I said, look at this. This is very interesting. They have chronology of all these different events. Like they've got the life of this guy Buddha, 563 BCE, the invasion of India, 520. There's another date here that's 327 before Christ. And notice here on these dates of these very historical, validatable events, like the Kushan Empire and everything, they have date ranges for them, but the date ranges all end and they have the hundreds placed down, the tens placed down, and the ones placed down. So they know for sure that this Murian dynasty went from 321 BC to 185 BC.
Except that they don't really. You see, this chart for babies doesn't give the uncertainty ranges of any of this. You see, in the ancient world, dates are hard to correlate and know for sure when compared to our modern calendar. For one thing, many societies didn't keep a count of years that just continuously ticked up until fairly recently. Instead, numbering years was based on how long their monarch had reigned up until that point. So if monarchs overlap or there is a civil war, dating by this method can become hard to disambiguate. Further, monarchs have been known to exaggerate the length of their reigns. Now, archaeology can help constrain dating estimates by giving independent methods for dating things. For example, if a coin says it was minted in the second year of the reign of Abu Ja'far Abdullah, the second Abbasid Caliph, we might be able to assign it to a date of 755, 756, or 757 based on our understanding of things like the fact that the Islamic calendar year is shorter than the solar year, and our historical records, and when this caliph reigned based on both the caliphate's internal records as well as the records of foreigners who had diplomatic, trade, or hostile interactions with the caliphate. Let's say it was found in a midden, which is just a fancy word for a trash dump of historical significance. Well, we can test organic material from that time, and we'll probably end up with a date that is in the mid-8th century, give or take a decade or so, which matches up reasonably well with our dating based on historical records. But as we go back farther and farther in time, records become more scarce, both because literacy was more scarce, and because as time goes, any given historical record has a greater and greater chance of being destroyed. So that the proportion of surviving historical records versus those that were ever created at a given time goes down as you look back in time. As a result, if you wanted to date a papyrus from the reign of Pharaoh Khufu, you will have much more ambiguity, because we're not looking at 1,400 years into the past, but more like 4,500 years into the past. Our records of that time are more fragmentary, and of necessity, our empirical dating techniques are less precise. All of this being said, our dating ranges will still tend to cluster around year numbers that are not round numbers for the whole historical period, because if your date is 2574 BC, with an error margin of 5 years, and you're making a chart for babies who aren't really equipped to take on board all the things like conflicts in calendar length, the regnal years, and the error margins of thermoluminescence and carbon dating, you're going to simplify things, and probably cut out the error bar. But on the other hand, if the date you have is 54,323 years, give or take 300 years, you might as well drop off the 23, because it's tiny compared to the size of your error bar. But that doesn't mean you don't have knowledge about when such events occurred. It's just that it's less precise than in the first case. Also, I'd like to point out that if you want to know the consensus for when a certain thing occurred, looking at a textbook for children is not where you go. History, archaeology, and paleoanthropology have peer-reviewed literature, which is where you get the actual real consensus views. And they'll include the uncertainty in the dates, as well as how such dates were determined in the first place. So while I know that Biddle's audience is self-admittedly schoolchildren, he is attacking science but using non-peer-reviewed textbooks as his source for what science actually says. That's dishonest.
Now let's go to things of the distant past. Look at this. They have the era of Australopithecines, between about 1 and 4 million.
Dan here seems to imply that we have a margin of error on when Australopithecus lived of about plus or minus 1.5 million years. But really, what this says is that the genus Australopithecus existed for approximately 4 million years continuously.
They suddenly widen it way up. And then the era of Lucy, about 3.5 million years ago.
But Lucy is an Australopithecus, which is why her era overlaps with that given for Australopithecus. But being an individual as opposed to a genus, she only existed for at most a few decades, not 3 million years. So it's not that the wide range of dates for Australopithecus is a sign of uncertainty. It's a sign of the duration for which the genus to which Lucy belonged existed. Basically, Dan Biddle can't read a timeline made for babies.
Early experimentation with agriculture, they say, maybe 10,000 to 8,000 and 10,000 to 300. Look at all the zeros here.
Yep, dates from before historical records, that is dates from before the invention of writing, can't be cross-checked with written records. So all we have is various kinds of empirical dating, which can have fairly high margins of error. But also, he keeps implying that the date ranges are an indication of uncertainty. But all of the dates on this timeline have uncertainty, and the fact that it isn't given for the dates with single numbers means that these ranges aren't there to indicate uncertainty, but date ranges over which some event transpired. I mean, think about it. Did, quote, experimentation with agriculture happen only a single year and then humans had it figured out, at least locally? Of course not. Agriculture is a sophisticated technology that would take a long time to figure out. That's why it took thousands of years to have it be a reliable basis for civilization. And so, because this period lasted for a long time, date ranges are given. And as for the zeros, yeah, again, the book is for babies, so you gotta simplify things. But God forbid Dan ever actually look at things like the actual dating methods used to come up with these numbers. They don't return round numbers, they return something with error bars that contain round numbers. And for the sake of convenience, we give those round numbers to children.
So over here we know precise history, validatable, reliable history. Over here, big, long ranges.
Yep, because some things take a long time, and we don't have it written down.
Because they're estimates, because they're based on theory and inference that we can't go back and test, because we can't go back that far. There's only 4,000 to 5,000 years of history.
Interestingly, yes, there is more than 5,000 years of recorded history, which means that both the Mesopotamian and Egyptian civilizations managed to get through the flood that wiped out all flesh. Weird that. But let's say we wanted to test when the first experiments with agriculture were being done by humans. First, we know we have reliable, but not always precise as we'd like, dating methods that don't require history. Well, what would we look for? Well, one thing would be pottery for storing grain long term, another would be the remains of crops that are significantly modified, and another would be the rise of permanent dwelling, because of necessity, as a culture becomes dependent on farming, they also must start staying put. No more nomadic hunter-gathering lifestyles when there are crops to sow. And hey, guess what? That's how archaeologists came up with these estimates. I would be curious to know from Mr. Biddle which part of this he thinks is invalid.
So now let's turn to the number one reason that students believe in evolution. We did a huge research survey of hundreds and hundreds of kids, students actually between, I think, 18 and 25, asked them, what's the main reason you believe in evolution? And 72% of them said that the number one thing was human evolution, then Darwin's theory, fossils and transitions, and science as an authority. But this is the big one. You ask people why they believe in evolution, usually comes back to this. So even if you open up a 6th grade textbook, they say, well, look, we evolved from Australopithecines to Homo habilis to Homo erectus, and then on to Homo sapiens. Well,
it's more complicated than that, but that wasn't a completely awful description of human evolution. It ignores a lot of the complexity going on in human relatives that are no longer extant. But I suppose if you want to ignore groups that have no living descendants, then yeah, other than the fact that Denisovans and Neanderthals do have living descendants, that's about it.
Do you know, if you just look at over here, start with Australopithecines, you could take all of the 380 specimens that they have of Australopithecines and put them in a couple of Home Depot buckets.
I don't even care if that's true. Who cares? Lots of bones can fit in a small container if you arrange them for maximum density. This has nothing at all about what it tells us about the organisms. No one thinks that Australopithecines are related to humans because we have literal mountains of their bones.
That's it. That's all they have. Homo habilis, this one I really had to dig in and research because it was terrifying what I found out.
Really? Researching Homo habilis filled Dan with overwhelming fear? He was so scared that he ran screaming, literally. This is just murder of the English language.
I asked leading experts about this to confirm it. Guess how many complete Homo habilis fossils they have? None.
Yeah, because complete fossils basically don't exist. Guess how many complete T-Rex fossils we have? None. Think about what it means for a fossil to be complete. It would mean that every single bone is there and sufficiently intact that we can reliably reconstruct every single one without any reference to related organisms. Basically, complete fossils don't exist. But so what? You fill in the gaps with other fossils of the same or a closely related taxon. As an example, let's say you found a fossil hominid that was missing the skull and the feet, but then you found another fossil of the same species missing the torso and the pelvis. Well, guess what? You haven't found a single complete skeleton of this organism, but you have all the bones anyway. So who cares if no single find is complete? That's what we expect. Now, I am exaggerating a bit. Complete fossils are found in Lagerstätten, but such formations are exceedingly rare, and to my knowledge, no hominid remains are associated with any Lagerstätte. A fact that's true for most fossil taxa.
0. They have 100 pieces of bones that they invented a taxon for and said, well, we don't know where these fit. They look kind of human, they look kind of ape. So let's take these 100 little pieces of bones and invent a new taxon and call them Homo habilis, which means handyman.
Okay, for this one, I turn to our resident hominin person, Gutsick Gibbon, because she knows far more about this topic than I do, so rather than give my hot take, I asked for her scholarly and well-researched take. So here's what she had to say. The idea that Homo habilis, a very notable transitional species displaying morphology between that of Australopithecines and genus Homo, is simply a fake species composed of human and Australopithecine bones, betrays a level of desperation commonly reached by modern young Earth creationists. Those who make this claim know very little about paleoanthropology, as many of the specimens of Homo habilis are represented by whole or partial skulls, and thus cannot be a mixed bone bag of multiple species. Occasionally, the skulls are accused of being fraudulent, as the accusers have not read enough of the literature to be exposed to the in situ photographs of many of these transitional species still cemented in the ground where they were found. The skulls of Homo habilis are additionally not the only hominins that are mosaic in nearly every aspect of their morphology. Creationists must also contend with Australopithecus sediba, Homo rudolfensis, Homo gautengensis, Homo georgicus, and Homo ergaster. Each of these species, documented extensively in their excavation, not only represents a morphology between the Australopithecines and genus Homo in brain case size, but also facial morphology, relative prognathism, suborbital ridges, dentition, and palate, and postcrania, derived pelvis, lower limbs, and hands, but basal upper limbs and ribcage. These species, represented by dozens of studies and specimens, cannot be written off due to inconvenience, although this is precisely what Genesis Apologetics attempts to do, as evidenced by their completely absent discussion of the paleoanthropology itself.
But they don't have a single complete skeleton. That's just an invented taxon. Homo erectus are just humans, and then Homo sapiens.
Homo erectus is a well-defined species, and it is not just short people or something like that. The differences are numerous, especially in the skull shape and size. There are differences in the orbit, the zygomatic arch, the brain case, the dentition, the shape of the tooth row, etc., etc. Check the sources in the description for more information about this, but suffice it to say that there is no competent paleoanthropologist who could even entertain the idea that Homo erectus and Homo sapiens are the same species.
So that's their idea of millions of years of evolution. Here is Lucy. That's their best shot. Every 6th grade kid is going to spend a week or two learning about Lucy. She was only 3.5 feet tall, about 60 pounds. Stands up real close to this young gal here. Just very, very baboon, chimp-like looking creature.
First, baboons and chimps are not exactly hard to distinguish. You can't look like both except by being just broadly a catarrhine monkey, which includes humans too. Lucy looks nothing in particular like a baboon, but she does indeed look a bit like a chimp, which is to be expected as the common ancestor of genus Pan and genus Homo didn't live all that long before her, and so there wasn't that much divergence between the lineages. But significantly, she had a pelvis that was unsuited to knuckle walking like a chimpanzee, and a knee that was far too straight in alignment for a chimpanzee type of locomotion, but which was suited for upright locomotion. Significantly, however, it was less well adapted to bipedality than a modern human leg. Kind of exactly what you'd expect in a transitional form, a mosaic of traits of each bone.
They only have about 40% of her skeleton that they found, so they found this. Here's the different skeleton pieces that they found, and then they drew this in school textbooks.
Lucy is just one specimen. We have hundreds of specimens of Australopithecus, as Biddle himself admitted, although for some reason he has also decided to tell us how many trash bins they could fit in, as if that had some relevancy. But that means that we can get a pretty complete picture of the anatomy of these animals, and so it is possible to give detailed skeletal and musculature reconstructions. Of course, integument, or skin and fur, is much harder and more speculative. Perhaps Lucy was as hairy as a gorilla or as sparsely furred as a modern human. We can't really know for sure. Creationists seem to have this thing for named individual fossils, and what they can tell us on their own. But the thing is that, like in all science, the complete body of knowledge is far more important than any one find. If we completely obliterated the Lucy specimen, we'd still have a very good picture of Australopithecus anatomy at this point. So even if 40% were a small amount of a skeleton, which it certainly is not, it wouldn't matter.
So it doesn't take very long to see the guesswork going into this. So now they've got her walking upright, they added feet, they added hands, they added all kinds of inferences about her, the slope of her face.
Well, we know for a fact that Lucy walked upright based on the shape of her own pelvis and knee, and we have other skulls and hands and feet from her species to tell us how those parts of her anatomy worked. So I'm not seeing a problem here.
They gave her a boyfriend and a kid. Very, very interesting, Lucy.
Well, we know Australopithecines in general reproduced, otherwise they wouldn't have existed. So it's not like showing a family unit is all that crazy. I mean, what next? Will you complain that they gave her lips, a feature shared by all therian mammals? Seriously, nothing about this reconstruction is very speculative at all. It's just that this very conservative reconstruction makes Biddle uncomfortable because he knows that this is exactly the so-called ape man that shows that humans did in fact evolve from other apes, and that they share a common ancestor with chimpanzees.
Lucy was actually a quadrupedal ape that went extinct during the Ice Age, so about 4,000 years ago, and there's not many of them.
Nope. Her anatomy precludes habitual quadrupedalism. Her arms are too short, her knees are too straight, and her pelvis too narrow. Now, she probably would have been better at moving on all fours than a modern human, but it was not her normal mode of locomotion. And further, as for the Ice Age, there isn't a single Australopithecine from any Pleistocene deposits. And since Biddle thinks that that age in geology corresponds to an indefinable time after the flood, that means that even though he ludicrously shortens the time frame involved, there is no evidence of Australopithecus in the Ice Age. They died out long before that, except for the ones that went on to found genus Homo. So Dan can't even keep his own pathetic excuse for a model straight.
They look very, very chimp-like. But I would think if human evolution had happened, that we would have lots and lots of these fossils.
We do, by Dan's own admission. So he's just a liar now. He already said that we have lots of specimens, and now he's saying we don't. One of those times, he was knowingly saying something he believes is not true.
But when you go look at Lucy in museums today, look what they always do with her eyes. Isn't that interesting? You ever been to the zoo and seen an ape with eye whites? No, because apes don't have eye whites. They don't have sclera like humans do.
I can't remember if I've specifically seen a non-human ape with eye whites at the zoo. But they do exist, as you are all looking at them on screen right now. So unless the point is it doesn't count unless you have seen it yourself, which is a literal flat earth argument, then who cares? All apes can have white sclerae.
They do that to exaggerate her human-like appearance. So every museum you go to, she's got eye whites and she looks like she's philosophizing somehow.
I don't know about philosophizing. I've seen some pretty pensive-looking chimps and gorillas, and even in person. But yes, the white eyes are there to make her look more human than she would without them. And the thing is, we don't know how accurate that is. We know that any ape can have white sclerae, so some Australopithecus certainly did. But we don't know if it was all of them, most of them, some of them, or what. But the thing is, we do know that because essentially all modern humans have white sclerae, and other apes have it only rarely, that the dominance of this trait had to come about after the split between humans and chimpanzees. The way we know this is called phylogenetic bracketing, where you use the distribution of some traits across well-established taxa to determine where the trait was gained or lost in evolutionary history. Since we can't really say more than that this trait was gained in the human lineage after the split, where we place it is arbitrary. So it's certainly not wrong to give reconstructions of Australopithecus these eyes, but it would also be fine not to.
Very interesting. So let's look at Lucy's skull. It was sloped and ape-like. You see the brown parts here are what they found. The white parts are all imagination. That's all plaster of Paris. They only found these little pieces. The rest they completely guessed on.
No, they are a careful reconstruction based on other skulls of members of the same species, and a detailed knowledge of hominid anatomy on the part of the researchers. Plus, I can't imagine that Dan would want the skull to be more human, so what's the complaint here?
And if you look at the slope of her face and the angle in which the spine entered the base of her skull, absolutely ape-like.
Well, no. The foramen magnum, which is what he's talking about in Lucy, was placed at the bottom of the skull, about the same as a human, but the angle of the opening was not the same, and was more like that of a chimpanzee. This is again consistent with the idea that Lucy was a habitual biped, but less well adapted to that mode of locomotion than any modern human. Exactly what you'd expect in a transitional species between basal apes and humans. And that really is the point. Lucy is a mosaic of basal and derived hominin traits in every bone. And also, while we don't have much of Lucy's skulls, we do have several essentially complete skulls from her conspecifics.
Lucy walked at such an angle, her face was so sloped that she couldn't have walked upright, because if she looked down, she'd be staring at her big nose standing out about right here.
Yes, because as we all know, no animal with a snout can crane its neck down to look at what's going on under its feet. That's just impossible if you have a snout. Seriously, this isn't even an argument. I'm not sure if it's supposed to be one, or if Biddle here is dumb enough to actually take it seriously. But I'm leaning towards him just being stupid.
So very sloped, and we also know from her foramen magnum, which is the hole in which their spine enters her skull, it came out about 18 degrees, just like chimps have today.
No.
Chimpanzees have the angle of their foramen magnum vary from 18 to 30 degrees, whereas Australopithecus varies it from 14 to 20 degrees. So while there is some overlap on the low end of chimpanzees and on the high end of Australopithecus, it is clear that these species are not identical in the angle of their foramina magna. Oh, and unlike Dan, you can feel free to read my sources. They're in the description.
So it was, and her slope was very sloped and ape-like, just like apes today. So look at her field of vision there. She would have all this area she couldn't see because she'd be looking down the slope of her nose, because her claim to fame is that she supposedly walked upright, but that wouldn't work too well.
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard. At no point in your rambling, incoherent response were you even close to anything that could be considered a rational thought. Everyone in this room is now dumber for having listened to it. I award you no points, and may God have mercy on your soul.
That field of view isn't going to get bigger if she walks on all fours. Her prognostic face is going to be there no matter how she walks. Like, I honestly don't even know what this point is.
For Lucy. Here's just a chart from some secular research saying, well, this is chimps and Lucy's. Look at her spine comes in an angle there, which would force her forward into a forward hunched over position, walking on all fours. Humans were designed for walking upright, and our spine enters in straight like this.
Oh hey, that same source was already in my list of sources before he even showed this slide. But oddly, that diagram of the chimp and human skull and profile doesn't occur anywhere in it. It's in a source both Dan and I used, and take a wild guess if the paper in question, The Cranial Base of Australopithecus afarensis, New Insights from the Female Skull, agrees with me, or with Dan. Yeah, if he has read this paper, then once again, Dan is lying. And if he hasn't, but he's presenting it as a source, well, he's lying again by citing a source he hasn't actually checked on. But also, up on the screen is the range of angle for the foramen magnum in these skulls, and it confirms that the ranges only have a small overlap and are generally quite distinct. Pro tip for creationists watching this: stop putting up the evidence that debunks your own claim on screen. Make me have to hunt for it. In fact, Dan Biddle is pretty good at refuting his own claims on screen. He also did it in a video about dinosaur extinction.
So look at the slope that chimps have in their spine, which is a slow-shaped C here. We have 4 curves to our spine. It's called lumbar lordosis, which is how you need to displace all the weight in your spine when you're walking upright. They have a slow kind of a bend, a shaped C. So very much chimp-like.
But notice that he did not show a diagram of an Australopithecus spine. Weird, isn't it? Probably because none of the literature shows the spine being essentially identical to that of a chimpanzee.
And they also know from skeleton or from skull scans that they've done on her semicircular canals that her posterior and anterior semicircular canals were only 50% the size of humans if you were to blow up her ear canal, her semicircular canals to be as big as humans. So much shorter. And guess what we use for balancing while we're walking upright? Those 2 semicircular canals.
But it's also what other apes use in walking and climbing. So it's not like she didn't have a sense of balance, and being smaller doesn't necessarily mean not as sensitive. So I'm not sure what the point is, but I can't really figure it out because unlike me, Dan tends not to cite his sources. So, Dan? Citation needed, amigo.
So many scientists doubt that Lucy was on her way to walking for that reason alone.
He's either using the word many wrong or the word scientist wrong. I'm not sure which one. I guess it could be both, but the fact is that essentially all scientists in the field in question know that Lucy walked upright, albeit less efficiently than modern humans do.
So they've actually learned that one of Lucy's vertebrae did not even belong to her.
Yep, the neural arches of Theropithecus thoracic vertebrae were initially assigned to the same specimen as Lucy. It's almost like all monkey vertebrae are similar, as if they're all descended from a common ancestor. But the thing is that we know that the hip, the knee, the skull, and the arms of Lucy weren't Theropithecus, because unlike an ambiguous partial vertebra of little diagnostic significance, those things are distinctly different from any baboon or even any non-ape, but are clearly the bones of an ape, and a bipedal one at that.
Lucy was sifted out of 20 tons of dirt over a 50 meters of dirt were sifted to find her, over 20 tons of dirt.
After looking through what literature is available on the internet, including the original paper publishing the find of Lucy, I can't find any evidence that this claim is accurate, but I also can't find anything contradicting it. But it is notable that many of these bones are too large for sifting to be necessary, so some aspects of Biddle account must be inaccurate. And the somehow bit is that when you find an associated bone and one of them is a morphologically similar bit of bone from another species, it's not hard to put it in the bunch. It's sort of like if you found the skeleton of a baby tiger in pieces. You didn't find the hand bones, but you did find the metacarpal of a similarly sized civet, so you included it in the find. Then a few decades later, someone comes and notices the mistake. That doesn't change the fact that you still have the skeleton of a baby tiger. This is what's happening here.
And so they somehow accidentally included a bone, her thoracic vertebrae here belonged to an extinct Therapithecus. So that doesn't sound, so if this part didn't belong to Lucy, I wonder what else doesn't belong to Lucy.
Probably none of it, because the paper that found this one misplaced vertebra examined all the rest of the skeleton and found that it was all Australopithecus. And since we don't have any duplicate bones, there's no reason to think that the skeleton is comprised of the remains of more than one member of A. afarensis. And even if we were to find that a few more bones were misidentified, Lucy is just one specimen of many of her species. So it's not as if our knowledge of human ancestry depends on this one find. But oddly, the rest of the skeleton is consistent with other Australopiths, almost like the skeleton belongs together, which, by the way, by presenting it as a single organism, the Creation Museum seems not to contest, even though they reconstruct the specimen in a knowingly inaccurate manner as a knuckle walker, when Lucy certainly couldn't have done this.
You go to museums today and they all still have this bone here, but evolutionists had admit, yeah, that's a gibbon bone, has nothing to do with Australopithecines.
A gibbon bone? I wonder if Dan knows that gibbons and gelada baboons aren't the same thing. Let's just say this. It's a good thing that Erica wasn't in this room, because I'm not sure Dan would have survived that after mixing up gibbons and geladas. But yes, it does seem that most museum displays have not removed the offending neural arch yet. But that's museum displays for the public. And also, like I've said, it's not like this bone's inclusion or exclusion really changes any of the conclusions about the anatomy of Lucy. This find didn't prompt a re-examination of any reconstructed anatomy, because none of it depended on that one bit of bone. Especially since, even ignoring the other specimens of A. afarensis, we have other definitively non-baboon and definitively Australopithecus thoracic vertebrae from that specimen to work with. Dan is making a mountain out of a finding that changes literally nothing we know about Australopithecus, and then working it into some conspiracy theory about the whole specimen being a chimera or something, even though the very source he used to conclude the bone in question is from a different animal, concludes quite strongly that the rest of the specimen is in fact authentically that of an Australopithecus afarensis female.
Now the paleontologists are actually arguing over Lucy's gender, and there's all these articles are coming out saying, well, is it Lucy or should we call it Brucey? It can be tricky to tell the sex fossils of ancestors. This one's a little creepy. This is out of the German of Human Evolution, and they say Lucy or Lucifer, gender confusion in the Pliocene.
As in all things in science, we question our conclusions, so that if we are mistaken, we can be corrected. That's specifically why science is trustworthy, because it is always giving the best possible answer with the data available. Sometimes that conclusion is wrong, but even when it is, there are not better answers to be found until new data and testing come in. But while this was a bit of a question in the 90s, I can't seem to find anything recent contesting Lucy's sex. Also, I will say that it is a bit weird to call this debate gender confusion, like it said in that NBC article. But who cares? Either way though, what challenge is it to the human evolution if the sex of Lucy was incorrectly identified? It doesn't make her not a bipedal ape with numerous skeletal features intermediate between basal hominids and modern humans. I mean, really, if Lucy had a penis, would that change anything about the transitional nature of Australopithecus? I can't see how.
Mary, I wonder why they chose that name. That's kind of interesting. So they can't decide if they should call it Lucy or Lucifer. So
it's because Lucy is a feminine given name meaning bright or shiny, and Lucifer is from the Greek for light bearer, and so they sound similar. And Lucifer is a masculine name. But even if that is some sinister plot to name a skeleton after the devil, so what? You can name things after the devil and it doesn't really change anything about the thing itself. Is Devil's Food Cake evil because it has the word devil in it? Yes it is. If you want to test this, next time you adopt a pet, name it Lucifer and see if that turns it evil. I have a strange suspicion it will not.
They've also discovered from Lucy's wrist that she had a locking bone system so that she could in fact walk on all fours.
No, they didn't, because Lucy's specimen doesn't have any wrist or hand bones, which Dan himself pointed out. But regardless, there is evidence of other members of Australopithecus afarensis having adaptations in the wrist that are also seen in chimpanzees and facilitate knuckle walking. But these features are also gone by the time we get to Australopithecus africanus, a later and even more human-like species. Of course, this is what you would expect for an only recently bipedal animal that descended from a knuckle-walking ancestor. vestigial traces of adaptations to the previous mode of locomotion. It is strange that sometimes, when Dan thinks it helps him, he'll pretend that Lucy is the only specimen of Australopithecus ever found, and that all of our knowledge of that genus's anatomy comes from this one find. But here, when he thinks he has a point about Australopith anatomy that comes from other finds, suddenly he's allowed to pull in data from other specimens. That's a nice double standard he's got there.
She had a concave and convex locking system here. It's where this little part of the end of your wrist bone locks into your hand structure like this, so that you can lock it into place, much like we lock our knees sometimes. And they have this little concave, convex system here, and humans don't have it. Humans are completely flat. We can't lock our wrists at all, so we can't walk or run.
But even in the picture here, the bone labeled Lucy is still intermediate between the more basal condition of the chimp and the more derived condition of the human.
So when kids are going into the number one reason that kids go into the ER is because they fall back on a skateboard or whatever, some kind of wheeled device. They try to break their fall and they end up breaking their wrists because we don't have locking structures just like what chimps would use to be able to walk on all fours.
I'm sorry, so is Dan claiming that locking your wrist would prevent broken wrists? How would that work? It's not like the energy is going to just not transfer to the bones because they're locked in place. In fact, locking bones in place makes them more likely to break, not less, because the energy can't even partially dissipate by flexing the joint. Also, Lucy herself died falling out of a tree, so I don't think this adaptation is such a wonderful way to avoid falling injury. Also, I'm not sure how this affects anything about human evolution. It's just Dan being dumb for no reason.
They also learned that her fingers were curved and ape-like, which would have really helped for her running around in trees.
Here's an interesting fact. The curve of ape finger bones, including humans, is subject to considerable phenotypic plasticity. Human gymnasts have curvy finger bones, and chimps raised in unnatural settings where they can't climb much have fairly straight phalanges. The curve tells you less about the genetics and more about the behavior of a particular ape in life. So, what this tells us is that Lucy climbed a lot. What it doesn't do is negate her status as a transitional form.
And over a few years ago, CNN just put this video out. It was based on a team of a bunch of forensic experts at the University of Houston that looked at Lucy's bones and determined that she had what's called green stick fractures in her wrist and on some of her leg bones because she apparently tried to brace her fall while falling 40 feet out of a tree traveling 35 miles per hour.
But Dan, you just said that because of her locking wrist that she wouldn't break her wrist if she used it to break her fall. I guess Dan was just lying about that too. And honestly, I don't really like to say that someone is lying, but when they can't even keep their story straight across a few sentences, it's hard to find an alternative explanation. Dan Biddle is a liar. It's really hard to come to any other conclusion. Oh, he's also a copyright troll, and there's an extremely high chance that all the videos in this series will be fraudulently copyright claimed by his organization.
So what is Lucy, the little ape that supposedly stood up and was walking like humans, doing 40 feet up in a tree, falling down? And they said, well, yeah, we pretty much can confirm she was awake when she hit because she tried to brace her fall from whatever she fell out of, and her bones bent like a green stick and then splintered and snapped.
She was probably doing the same things modern humans are doing in a tree. Climbing. It's not like being a bipedal ape precludes climbing. Trees are a handy place to find food and avoid some dangerous animals that can't climb trees, like a rhinoceros or an angry elephant. Plus, climbing trees is fun. That's why kids do it. And that's why even adult humans do it sometimes. Additionally, humans also get injured falling out of trees. I don't see why this behavior shared by all apes, humans included, indicates that Lucy wasn't a transitional form between basal hominids and modern humans. It makes as much sense as smugly pointing out that Lucy had eyes. Yeah, we would expect her to. If she didn't, it'd be weird. Similarly, since all apes climb trees, it'd be weird if Australopithecus didn't.
So that's what these forensic guys are saying. So that little ape is not walking around, she's hanging around in trees.
Yes, at the time when she died. But existing at all ever in a tree doesn't make her not a bipedal, mostly terrestrial animal. Like, I can't imagine Dan has never seen a terrestrial animal in a tree. Bears climb trees, humans climb trees, dogs sometimes climb trees, even crocodiles climb trees. This is just a non-argument.
This is Donald Johanson, the discoverer of Lucy, talking about how many different Lucy specimens they've found.
Only one Lucy has been found, because that's the nickname for a single specimen. What he's about to talk about is how many specimens of Australopithecus afarensis have been found. The species is not interchangeable with the name of a particular specimen. This would be like calling all of humanity Teresa because you know one human by that name.
We now have 400 specimens of Lucy's species Australopithecus afarensis, named after the Afar region. And we know that there are very large individuals, which were males, and the smaller ones are certainly females.
What Donald Johanson says on this BBC video is he says we now have 400 specimens of Lucy's kind, and we know which ones are male and which ones are female. So he says 400 specimens of Lucy's kind. And while he's saying that, they have hundreds and hundreds of upright, complete skeleton fossils parading across the screen.
Yes, because the public likes reconstructions, and provided they are not inaccurate, there is nothing wrong with reconstructions. And since we have basically every bone of the species to draw from, we can make accurate reconstructions.
What he's not telling the audience, what he means by 400 specimens of Lucy's kind, is this picnic table.
Except that that picture is taken from Dr. Johanson's own lectures, so he is telling people in it. Just not in that one cherry-picked clip. Which, by the way, I'm very confident Johnson didn't animate.
That's the specimens he's talking about. They show these. They say we now have 400 specimens of Lucy's kind while all these things are parading across the screen, but they actually only have 380 bone pieces. They think the other 20 are in a private collection somewhere, and 35% of that collection is just teeth.
Teeth are pretty important in mammals, especially. But I'm waiting for a point here. Each new specimen gives us more data, no matter how small the specimen is. If you find the proximal end of a tibia, that still gives you data about the Australopithecus tibia. If you find a few foot bones, that still gives you information about Australopithecus feet.
You can take the whole thing. Here's Lucy down here. Here's all Lucy's supposed friends. You can take the whole lot of it and put it in a 5-gallon Home Depot bucket. That's their evidence.
You know what no paleontologist has ever found significant about a collection of specimens? Their total volume. I cannot express in strong enough language how stupid it is to give you the approximate volume of a bunch of fossils as if that says anything about the quality of the science.
Okay, moving on from that.
Really? And then he just moves on without even trying to make a point? How does anyone take this man seriously?
But when you see Lucy, they added hands and fingers. They've given her eye whites. In Japan, they actually took her fur off. We had to put a bikini on her there. You know, she's got a little kid and a husband now.
Well, as Dan himself pointed out, we have a lot of hand and foot bones. In fact, Dan even thinks the conclusions about the hands are solid enough to pretend that they are a problem for evolution. So again, we have that double standard that we saw in the last episode. But yes, reconstructions vary in the areas where the skeleton can't give us information, like amount of body hair or eye coloration.
And look at these eye whites, and now we've got Lucy in deep thought, and she's got completely human-like hands and fingers. They didn't find Lucy's hands, they didn't find her fingers, they didn't find her feet, but they've given her hands and feet in museums.
No, but they did find them in other specimens, so...
Very interesting. So let's look at the next pillar as we continue to tour through here.
Okay, I guess we're done with the human evolution. The only species that matters to the story is apparently Australopithecus afarensis, and only one specimen of that species is important. So, who cares about Australopithecus africanus, Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, Homo neanderthalensis, Homo luzonensis, etc.? So, even if everything Dan said were true and indicative of Lucy not being a hominin, but instead some kind of chimpanzee, it wouldn't actually do anything to assail the rest of the evidence for human evolution, which would still be a strong conclusion from the remaining evidence. This has got to be one of the weakest attempts to refute the science of human origins that I've ever seen.
Pillars 3 and 4, which are adaptation and natural selection and mutations. These are the other pillars that you'll find in high school books.
So at least this time it's reasonable to call these pillars of evolution. Mutation, natural selection, and adaptation are all core parts of the theory, not just examples of it in action like human evolution is.
The Bible says, let these creatures reproduce after their kind. The Hebrew word is mean. And we know that animals create after their kind because the reproductive systems are locked to within seeds of their own kind. You never see a raccoon successfully breed with a cat or a cat with a dog. Animals are locked to within their kind by the reproductive system that God's assigned.
Which is also what we expect from evolution, because this kind of reproductive isolation is exactly what we would expect given speciation events, and speciation is basically the increase in biodiversity that evolution predicts.
and we've never seen a new kind emerge. And we have 4,000 to 5,000 years of recorded history. No one's ever watched evolution happen. We've never seen a new kind emerge.
Who wants to take bets on whether or not Dan gives us a definition for kind that is actually useful in determining if anything ever evolved into a new kind?
Well, this is one of the most famous contributions that Charles Darwin made. In the 1830s, he goes to the Galapagos Islands and he says, look at that, I've just formed clinched the case for evolution because I see finch beaks changing. I go to one island, I see some birds have short stubby beaks. I go to another island and they have long skinny beaks. Therefore, case closed, evolution is happening, because if you take those little variations and changes and slap on millions of years, you could have that bird turn into something else, some other creature.
We've also never seen a new Glorgitz emerge from the Frumplude either. Primarily because, those things don't have a definition, so we have no way of knowing if they emerged. Similarly, no one can say what a new kind emerging would even look like, since we can't identify kinds in the first place. So I'm going to go ahead and say that Dan here has never read Darwin's On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection or The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life, because the finches were cited as an example that led to his idea, not some conclusive proof of it. Darwin's case was built up by looking at many examples of both natural and artificial selection, and did not hinge on any one group of organisms.
That's what they believed. But now what have we learned since that discovery in 1835? We've thrown lots of science into looking at bird finch beaks. And what we discovered is that these Swedish scientists here followed 1,000 finches in a suburban and an urban environment, and they have now scientifically demonstrated that finches within a single generation can adapt their beak width and length based upon their food sources.
This is an example of what's called phenotypic plasticity, wherein a single genotype can result in more than one phenotype because of processes like muscle development, availability of nutrients, and yes, epigenetic changes. But that doesn't mean that changes in genotype don't occur. We can watch them occur both in the lab and the wild. The existence of phenotypic plasticity doesn't do anything to change the fact that genomes change over time.
And they've also learned at a chemical molecular level, it has nothing to do with evolution. It has to do with these creatures varying with what's called epigenetics.
Before we continue, I just want to point out that epigenetics is an evolutionary mechanism. It's not something that contradicts evolution, and also the degree to which portions of the genome can be affected epigenetically can itself evolve.
There are these little things called methyl tags that activate different gene expressions within the pre-existing code that God made to have in these finches so that they would vary based upon their food sources.
Ignoring the unwarranted attribution of cause to a divine agent, yeah, that's how epigenetics works. Genes which are not needed can be methylated so that they are less likely to be expressed, allowing other genes to be dominant, causing a change in morphology or chemistry. But I really am curious how Biddle is going to go ahead and turn this into, therefore the genome can't undergo selection due to pressures in the environment.
So what Darwin thought as evolution was actually God's amazing intelligent design, because he programmed into these creatures, hey, if you live on an island where you got to crack small hard nuts, you're going to need short little stumpy beaks for that. And if you're going to go plucking worms out of the beach that are trying to come up, you're going to need a long skinny beak. Now, they'll never turn into anything but finches, but they can vary within limits, and it can happen within a single generation.
Well, that's just the law of monophyly that says that finches, or more properly in this case, tanagers, thanks to Jackson Wheat for that bit of trivia, will never be not tanagers no matter how much they change. Let's say one of your ancestors is Genghis Khan, because if you're human, there's like a 1% chance he's your ancestor. Now let's say that 100 years from now, one of your descendants is born. Naturally, Genghis Khan will also be that kid's ancestor. So let's say that 1,000 years after that, that kid's descendant is born. And guess what? This new kid will still be a descendant of Genghis Khan. We can push it out to 1,000,000 years or 1,000,000,000. No number of generations can erase your ancestry. So no number of generations or amount of morphological change will allow a tanager descendant to ever be not a tanager.
But it gets better. Evolutionists used to go around beating up creationists all the time with blind cave fish. They would say, look at that, we can prove evolution because you take these little fish and then they evolve their eyes away because their eyes would be disadvantageous because they go into a little dark cave and they're bumping their eyes against the wall all the time and they get infections, and so they just evolve their eyes away. But do you know what happens when you take these same blind cavefish, take them out of the cave and put them into a setting with light? They grow their eyes back in 1 generation.
I can't decide if that's dumb or if he's lying. Read the article yourself if you want, it's linked in the description. These fish are Mexican cavefish of the species Astyanax mexicanus, and they live in multiple isolated caves throughout northern Mexico. This study was to see if all the populations that are blind for the same genetic reasons. You see, regardless of light levels, when you take a fish from a single cave and breed them in captivity, they always produce blind offspring. But if they were all blind for the same genetic cause, then breeding fish from different caves would also produce blind fish. However, if it were different genetic mechanisms causing blindness, then the fact that all the genes necessary for functioning eyes would exist between the two populations would mean that when you hybridize them, you should expect fish with eyes to be produced. In fact, this was the case. Only by hybridizing can these fish with eyes be born, and that is not dependent on light level.
So again, epigenetics toggling genes on or off, so that animals could do what? Spread and multiply and fill the earth just like God said.
Except this isn't an epigenetic phenomenon, because it is not contingent on the environment, but entirely on ancestry. The broken genes weren't toggled on, they were paired with functional genes on both parent sides that together meant that a full set of functioning genes for eye development were present.
It's the same thing with mice. This came out in a journal called Evolution. Mice, within 1 or 2 generations, can grow 2 things: longer tails, and get this, extra vertebrae, if they're living in trees.
This is the same thing again. This is not epigenetic, as the single generation changes only resulted from hybridization of different subspecies of the mouse Paromyscus maniculatus. So the change is entirely dependent on genetics and not on environment within a single generation. That means that the long and short-tailed populations genetically evolved different tail morphology, as evidenced in this study, which is linked below. It was also determined that the long-tailed mice did not form a clade, and the hybridization also supported this in that the genetic mechanisms for long tails were different in different long-tailed populations. Further, the word epigenetics occurs 0 times in this entire paper. Weird for a paper that supposedly concludes that these changes are epigenetic.
How do they know to do that? They're not doing that themselves. It's all pre-programmed, and they've actually proven here, this is technical speak, but they say longer tails have evolved repeatedly in forested habitat. Variation in these traits is controlled by a separate gene loci. So it's not evolution, it's gene expressions being turned on or off.
That's not what that phrase means. It means that different locations on the genomes control this variation between populations of mice. The difference is genetic according to that statement, not epigenetic. Dan here just read off a statement that contradicts him and claims it supports him. Maybe he's just that stupid, but we know he's been dishonest in the past, so who knows?
Pillars 5 and 6 of fossils and common ancestors. We know there's lots of fossils around the world. This is from FossilWorks database. All these little dots are fossil findings that are found all over the world. Here's a mid-Atlantic ridge system that we talked about last night. All of these big black lines here, this is the oceanic rift system that God broke open in Genesis 7:11 when all the fountains of the great deep broke open. It covers the earth 1.9 times over. These are the fountains of the great deep that broke open, and when that happened,
the entire earth was vaporized into a plasma where not just biology, but even chemistry breaks down. Because that's the kind of heat we're talking about according to both catastrophic plate tectonics and hydroplate theory, the only 2 flood models I'm aware of in flood geology literature.
it sent tsunamis up onto the land in a repeating, cycling way that buried them in stratified layers.
Except that we know how to recognize tsunamite, which is the kind of rock left behind by a tsunami, and virtually none of the fossil record is in such deposits.
That's why we see the marine life buried first, followed by some land creatures, followed up by reptiles and mammals, and then finally man.
Okay, so why are flying creatures found with some only in lower strata like pterosaurs, but birds can be found all the way to the top? Why didn't the pterosaurs and birds all get buried together in the top layers? Why are the marine deposits in the top layers full of fossils of whales? Why aren't they with the trilobites? Why is it that once terrestrial creatures appear, we find them with aquatic creatures at the same levels of the geologic strata all throughout? If it were true that the terrestrial deposits were restricted to the upper strata, this would make sense, but it's not true. This ecological zonation doesn't bear even the most cursory examination.
The fossil order that's used to pitch evolution in school textbooks like this, they say, well, we evolved from these simple little creatures and then moved up and moved up and moved up. That data does not prove evolution. It proves a fossil burial record from Noah's flood.
Except it's sorted exactly the way the flood wouldn't sort it, and exactly the way evolution would.
And that's exactly what we see, because the ocean life was buried first. Amphibians and reptiles could run for it, mammals, birds, and finally humans.
I would like to introduce you all to Paleobatrachus, a genus of frogs that lived in Europe from possibly the late Cretaceous all the way to the Middle Pleistocene, long after humans appear in the fossil record for the first time. Why did they manage to hop their way to where the humans were, while other frogs, like Triadobatrachus, got stuck in the early Triassic? Now let's look at Geosternbergia sternbergi. This magnificent beast flew around during the late Cretaceous, and this is Apiornis maximus, a bird that lived well into the period of human fossil remains. Apiornis was flightless and barely even had wings. So why did it manage to run up the hills to safety with the humans, while the flying pterosaur couldn't make it to high ground any faster than a lumbering ankylosaurus? I don't think Dan has any answers to this.
People say, well, why don't we find a lot of human fossils? Because
we do find a lot of human fossils, but we should be finding them all over the place if a flood occurred.
humans are smart. They could run for it. They could build makeshift rafts. They're going to go to the highest hills. They're going to try to last as long as they could because it took 150 days before the flood zenithed.
In 2004, an earthquake in the Indian Ocean caused a series of tsunamis all across the ocean's coastlines. More than 53,000 people died in a single tsunami. But Dan here seems to think that humans can easily escape numerous and repeated even taller tsunamis because they're smart. Well, apparently they can't just run away from a tsunami fast enough, so this doesn't do anything to explain why we don't see humans with the first terrestrial fossiliferous deposits. Humans like to live on the coast, and if they were living on the coast with a bunch of carboniferous griffin flies and parareptiles, they wouldn't have escaped, and they too would have been buried in those deposits.
So those guys had 5 months to run around and scamper and try to survive during a cataclysmic flood.
Yeah, the people already living on high ground probably would have sought even higher ground. But what about the people who were killed in the first and second tsunamis, who wouldn't have time to run for the hills? But just for fun, let's look at some more animals that don't fit the idea of ecological zonation. Meet Cartorhynchus, an adorable ichthyosaur from the early Triassic. It lived in the ocean. Why don't we find it with trilobites? Meet also Leviathan, a sperm whale that lived up to the Pliocene, some of the top layers of the geological column. How come we don't find it with Cartorhynchus, but instead in layers of the same age as the ones where we find birds and terrestrial mammals?
So even Charles Darwin said, by his theory, innumerable transitional forms must have existed. Why do we not find them embedded in the countless number in the crust of the earth? And he goes on to say, assuredly, geology does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. It's the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against the theory.
But we know of lots of them. Let's take a look at a few, shall we?
Well, we've been digging for over 150 years more, and we see more stasis, which is static creature. When creatures show up on the fossil record, yeah, there's some changes that happen here or there, but creatures are living out.
Yes, stasis is more common than observable change, but we do observe change. In fact, by saying stasis is more common, Dan implies that change also occurs. But nothing about evolution demands that all lineages be undergoing gross morphological change constantly through time.
As they were designed to live out. So evolution would say about bats that bats supposedly would start out like a little rat creature and then somehow grow some advantageous features to get some wings that would grow on. So you've got this rat eventually evolving into a bat with lots of brats in the in-between.
Well, it certainly wasn't a rat, since bats are not closely related to rodents. In fact, Biddle is more closely related to a rat than a bat is, and by quite a lot, too.
So that's what evolution would say. But you know, when we go collect bats and bat fossils and you look at them in museums, they've collected over 1,000 bats. How many of these things do you think they found? None. They don't have any. So we should have lots of pre-bats, but they found 0 pre-bats.
Should we have lots of pre-bats, though? You see, the first bats were probably arboreal forest dwellers, and forests are well known for leaving behind essentially no animal fossils. And the fact that you can pick lineages with obscure fossil origins doesn't erase the other lineages for which we have an excellent fossil record, like Sirenians, Proboscideans, Carnivorans, Hominids, Neoceratopsians, Coccolithophores, Chelicerates, etc.
What about turtles? Well, we've got 100,000 turtles that are displayed in museums. How many pre-turtles do you think they found?
Depending on what you mean, we have dozens of stem turtles in the fossil record, including some that are transitional between the basal pantastudines and modern turtles, like Eunodosaurus, Papocheles, Odontocheles, and Proganocheles.
0 pre-turtles. When you find a turtle in the fossil record, it always just shows up as a turtle.
So what's Odontocheles, which has a plastron but no carapace? It's not a full turtle since it doesn't have a full turtle shell, but it's got half a turtle shell. Seems like a perfect transitional turtle to me.
It goes on with dinosaurs, pterosaurs, sea lions, seals. This guy, Carl Werner, he went through 60 different museums for 10 years, taking pictures of all this stuff and interviewing people. The transitional forms just don't exist.
Well, we've already seen quite a few examples of them, so they do exist.
They think they have 2. They've got Archaeopteryx and Tiktaalik.
We have way more than 2, but those 2 are cool transitional forms.
Basically, paleontologists are coming out admitting, well, this thing that we thought was a transitional species is just a bird. It's a perching bird, and no amount of paleobabble is going to change that.
Man, it's Alan Fiducia. Drink! I've already covered this in depth, so let's just reuse some of that footage because I'm a lazy hack fraud of a YouTuber. Except no, it didn't have a perching foot. The apparently inverted digit 1 on the pez of the London specimen was a taphonomic artifact. That being said, Archaeopteryx probably did spend a lot of time in the trees, but it probably used both its hands and feet to clutch onto trunks or large branches. While it does have a larger than average wishbone, or more properly, furcula, compared to other theropods of its size, it's not nearly as derived as we see in even relatively primitive birds like groundfowl. It's basically the same shape as the furcula of a Tyrannosaurus rex. It's actually far more basal than you might expect, given how outwardly bird-like Archaeopteryx would look. Having basal non-bird traits is what we should expect to see in a transitional fossil. That's what makes it transitional in the first place. Archaeopteryx had a long bony tail with no picostyle, it had thecodont teeth, it had no keel on its sternum, it had unfused wing fingers, it had a dewclaw like hallux rather than an inverted one like a perching bird. It also had a hip that was more or less identical to Velociraptor, and not very much at all like those of modern birds. I mean, this is precisely what you'd expect to find if birds evolved from dinosaurs. You'd see animals with many more basal traits mixed in with some derived avian traits.
And Tiktaalik, that little creature that they thought was eventually growing flippers and going out of the sea life and going on to land.
Let's be clear, it's famous because it's morphologically intermediate between basal fish-like Eotetrapodiformes and early tetrapods, which it manifestly is. It is among the most basally branching stegocephalians, a group that includes all land animals with 4 limbs and a backbone, but also includes much more fishy animals like Tiktaalik.
Same thing there, they've now found fossils that they believe were 10 million years earlier that have even more advanced features than Tiktaalik. So from an evolutionary perspective, that one got shot down as well.
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard. At no point in your rambling, incoherent response were you even close to anything that could be considered a rational thought. Everyone in this room is now dumber for having listened to it. I award you no points, and may God have mercy on your soul.
Meet the pipefish, Morphologically, more or less identical to the sygnathed common ancestor of dragonfish, seahorses, and of course, the pipefish. You'll note that other than the funny mouth, this is a pretty normal but skinny fish. It swims with its tail, it doesn't have pregnancy in males, its tail isn't prehensile. The survival of the basal pipefish millions of years after some of their relatives became really derived, pregnant male dorsal fin swimmers with prehensile tails, doesn't mean that such a transition didn't occur, and the pipefish remains a transitional form between seahorses and the wider Sygnathiformes, which includes animals like the shrimpfish, trumpetfish, and flying gurnards, the last of which are themselves highly derived in a completely different way, showing that evolution is about diversity. So, as we can see, a transitional form can persist alongside more derived forms just fine, and that doesn't make it not transitional.
So what about homological structures? You open up a high school textbook today and they'll say, well, look, we know evolution happened because dolphin hands are the same as all the whale hands and the human hands because they usually have one main bone and then a couple bones that break up after that, and then they go on to maybe 5 digits, just like humans have.
Of course, for those of us that managed to get past high school anatomy, those bones are the humerus, the radius and ulna, the carpals, then the metacarpals, and the phalanges.
So they say, look at that, we are going to infer or impose evolution on these similar structures. Well, to me, that's kind of like saying, well, you know, this wheel could lead to that wheel, could lead to this wheel, could lead to that wheel.
Well, since cars aren't organisms that reproduce with variable genetics, leading to what all of us, even Dan Biddle, acknowledges as descent with modification, pointing to cars is irrelevant.
If you're God and you're going to design all these creatures and creatures need to locomote, they need to go around in the sea or get around on land, they're going to need flippers and fins or hands. So it's a common design thing, not evolution at all.
Oh, okay. So whale flippers and ray-finned fish flippers should have about the same skeleton, same for bat wings and bird wings and pterosaur wings. And the same for, say, horse legs, the cheetah legs, ant legs. Weird how that isn't at all the case, since, you know, they have different designs. Do they perhaps have different designers? Or perhaps it's just that evolution doesn't have the ability to plan or borrow from distant lineages to copy-paste anatomy, so it results in different solutions to the same problems when the problem is faced by organisms with different anatomy. But even so, the forms these organs take are based on the ancestral forms because evolution can't simply abandon the basic anatomy of an organism. This is why all tetrapods have the exact same limb bones, but why in pterosaurs, bats, and birds, and Scansoriopterigids, we get the same bones in quite different configurations, all to achieve the same goal, flight. This is precisely what we don't see in cars, where features can be lifted wholesale if they work well and placed into a brand new design, and we are not bound by the previous year's design to make the new model.
What about vestigial structures? So evolutionists for years were saying, oh, look at that, we've got all these leftovers in our human body. Like we used to have a tail attached to our tailbone.
Well, no, the tailbone essentially is the human tail. It is the caudal vertebrae of apes. The ancestors of humans would have just had more and more unfused caudal vertebrae back when they had tails.
You can rip your tonsils out when you get sick. You know, you don't need those. That's not really part of our lymph system.
Well, it is part of the lymphatic system, but it's not vital. And while just removing them at the drop of a hat is not a good idea, since surgery is risky, when they become a problem, they can and routinely are removed with no significant long-term impact, excluding immediate complications from the surgery.
And, oh, your appendix, so let's just take that out and throw it away. We don't need any of this stuff.
You don't need your appendix. And like with tonsils, when it is removed, there's essentially no long-term ill effect beyond the possible complications of the surgery. But it is a handy refuge for gut bacteria.
Well, evolution says that if this has happened, if we've evolved over millions of years, our body should be filled with all these vestigial leftover parts that we really don't need anymore.
Which it is. For example, despite clearly being caudal vertebrae in form and development, the vertebrae of the tailbone never support a postanal tail. Similarly, the appendix has the form and embryological development of a vermiform cecum, which in other animals is used as a sort of fermentation chamber for plant matter that is hard to digest. It does not help humans with this, despite clearly being the same organ, so it is a vestige of a once active site of digestion.
Well, as of 1895, if you go back to the leading medical textbooks of 1895, they said, you know what? We've got 180 leftover parts in our body for evolution. That was the best science as of 100 years ago.
It's good to see that Dan is reading the latest in research.
Today, medical science says 0. We don't have anything that we don't need. We need every part of our body, even things like the appendix, the coccyx or tailbone, or our tonsils.
No, you don't. You don't need an appendix. You don't need your tonsils. You don't need the tiny muscles that make your hair stand on end. You don't need all of your fingers or toes. You don't need your gallbladder. You don't need the facial muscles that move your ears. You don't need most of your hair. You don't need all your teeth. You can remove a lot of things from the human body without causing death or even significant problems at all. Heck, you don't even need both of your lungs. One will do you.
The appendix is a storehouse for your healthy flora. So when you have to get that removed, sometimes you've got to take probiotics, because when you get sick and you lose everything out of your intestine, the appendix saves some of the healthy gut flora and re-injects it so you can start the digestive process again. It's an amazing part of our body.
But you don't need it, as Dan just admitted.
The tailbone, well, let's just be honest, it's got to end somewhere, right? Your spinal column's got to end somewhere. Do you know it's called the pelvic floor? It goes down here and it cups the bottom of your spine right above your legs, so that it can all have all these attachment points for ligaments and tendons. It's your bladder. We would have a real hard time giving birth or going to the bathroom if it wasn't for our tailbone. And when you look at this thing, look at all the holes that we have in there for the nerves to run through. That is an amazing, amazing design. We have all these tendons and ligaments. It's a perfect place for cupping all the weight load that we have in our bodies. That's not leftover from evolution. That's by design.
Except that they're caudal vertebrae that don't support a tail. So whatever else they are, they're vestigial tailbones. Vestigial doesn't mean has no function. It means an organ has reduced or no function at the original function of the organ. So the coccyx doesn't do the tail thing at all, so it's a vestigial tail. The appendix doesn't ferment food at all, so it's a vestigial cecum. No matter what they do now.
Tonsils, when I was a kid, everybody was getting their tonsils pulled out. You get strep throat, you go in there and they'd give you some penicillin and send you home with ice cream. Everybody loved it. It seemed like in third grade, all kinds of kids were getting dismissed to go have their tonsils cut out. I was just waiting for it. But now they've learned that tonsils are actually part of your lymph system. They form a first-line defense, so when you start getting a throat infection, your tonsil is the first one on it.
Yes, it does help fight off infections that happen to be inhaled into the mouth, but that's about it. It's really not very important, although I'd hesitate to call it completely vestigial. But here's the thing, vestigial also doesn't mean unimportant, so no matter how important an organ is, it can still be vestigial.
We've gone from 180, which they used to think, all the way down to 0.
I have no idea how many vestigial structures there are in a human body, but we know for certain that it's not 0. Because in trying to dismiss the idea of vestigial structures in the body, Dan actually gave us examples.
Certainly no leftovers. So let's take a quick look at whale evolution. They've been beating the kids up for decades with these little hip bones. They call them vestigial hip bones. You can go grab a biology textbook today, pull it right up off the shelf, and they'll say, look at that. The whales used to have these things. It's a leftover pelvis. It's even got a femur and everything. And they say, here's a note from a high school textbook. It says, many organisms retain traces of their evolutionary history. For example, the whale retains pelvic and leg bones as useless vestiges.
I wouldn't call them useless, but they are vestiges of terrestrial locomotion, which doesn't make them not vestigial pelvic and limb bones. Let's look at a whale skeleton. Whales are pretty unusual when it comes to mammals. The forelimb girdle is pretty standard, except for those freaky phalanges. But it does appear that whales lack a pelvis, at least in an ordinary sense. Those little bones here are the whale's pelvis, femur, and a lower leg bone, probably a tibia. Only the pelvis is really what we're talking about, but most of what I say about the pelvis will also apply to the leg bones. Okay, well, how do we know that's what they are then? For this, we will have to dig into evolutionary developmental biology, or Evo-Devo as it's called. You've probably heard of Ernst Haeckel and his embryo drawings. He came up with the law that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, which is to say that as an animal grows from a zygote, it passes through the adult forms of its evolutionary ancestors. This is wrong, but it doesn't mean that embryology doesn't give us interesting information about the evolution of animals. You probably haven't heard of Carl Ernst von Baer. He came up with the laws of embryology that have actually held up. There are 4 of these laws, and here they are. The more general characters of a large group appear earlier in the embryo than the more special characters. For example, the notochord develops before the limbs, and the limbs develop before the hair in a mammal. From the most general forms, the less general are developed, and so on, until finally the most special arises. Embryos tend to look pretty similar early on, and diverge into specialized forms revealing their adult identity later. Every embryo of a given animal form, instead of passing through the other forms, rather becomes separated from them. Contrary to Haeckel's so-called law, animals do not pass through the adult stage of other forms. Rather, they diverge from the embryonic forms of such animals. The embryo of a higher form never resembles any other form, but only its embryo. For example, a human embryo never looks like an adult fish or lizard, but it does look like a fish embryo and a lizard embryo at certain points of development. Embryos develop according to instructions from certain regulatory genes, such as homeobox genes, that give signals causing cells to do one of a small number of things. Embryonic cells can divide, or grow, fold, undergo apoptosis or die, and finally differentiate into particular cell types like neurons, muscle cells, or osteocytes. Essentially, these instructions are more like the folding diagram for origami than the blueprints for a house. They choreograph a dance of growth, change, and death, rather than being a representation of the final product. Because different animals start off as similar embryos, and the time when their embryos start to differentiate gets later the more similar the animals are, we can use embryology to check to see what parts of an animal are homologous. Homologous structures are essentially the same feature in different organisms. So your radius and ulna are homologous to the radius and ulna in a whale, a bird, a horse, a lizard, or any other tetrapod. We know this not just because the bones are in about the same place and arrangement in all tetrapods, but also because they all develop from the same embryonic structures in the anterior limb buds. This is important because it means that from a structural standpoint, the only difference between different animals is how long and when certain features develop and grow. If a human embryo got the same regulatory signals during embryonic development as a dog, it would come out looking essentially like a dog, even though its biochemistry would be 100% human. Of course, there's really no way to make this happen, and I hope no one tries it, at least not with a human. I kinda like you monkeys. This is how we know that even very different structures are homologous. For example, jaw bones in reptiles, ear bones in mammals, and gill arches in lampreys are all homologous. We know because they develop from the same embryonic features, that is, pharyngeal arches. That's why before we ever found the fossils that would confirm it, we knew that the fish jaw evolved from gill arches, and that mammal ear bones evolved from those same gill arches that had already been turned into jaw bones. And interestingly, you can see mammal ear bones migrating from near the jaw into the ear during embryonic development. What does this have to do with those tiny whale bones Kent was blathering about? Well, cetaceans, like all tetrapods, form 4 limb buds. 2 for the hind legs, 2 for the front legs. In cetaceans, the hind limb buds stop growing almost immediately, and the rest of the body more or less absorbs them. But at the same time, the tissues in the limb bud that in all tetrapods become the pelvic girdle, in whales, become those bones in question. Further, the leg bones that some whales have also develop from the hind limb bud. So we know that those bones are the remnants of a pelvis precisely because they have the same embryonic development. They are the same thing as your hip bones, coming from the same place on an essentially identical embryo, in a developmental process that conforms to all of von Baer's laws of embryology. There are even more clues to this. Whales, like all mammals, have different kinds of vertebrae. From front to back, they are cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and caudal. The sacral and lumbar vertebrae are basically the same, but anterior to the bones in question, an interesting change happens in the spine. The vertebrae become distinct as caudal vertebrae, and this also marks the end of the organs in a whale that a different mammal would have in their abdominal cavity, such as intestines. So just like in other mammals, these bones are associated with the change to caudal vertebrae. So we can now say with some certainty that these bones are the vestigial remnants of the pelvis of the whale's ancestors, and we didn't even have to use a single fossil to do it, although fossil evidence has confirmed this too. Okay, but Hovind pointed out that these bones have very important functions, and you know what? He's actually right about that. In fact, I would go so far as to say that without these bones, whales couldn't reproduce. So does that mean that these bones aren't vestigial? Well, no, not even a little bit. All being vestigial means is that an organ is reduced and no longer performs the basal purpose. That is, it doesn't do what it did in an animal's ancestors. In fact, you could say that some of your ear bones are actually vestigial gills. They are certainly reduced, and good luck breathing underwater with your ears. But having a present function doesn't make a structure not vestigial. Human tailbones are vestiges simply because they don't form a tail, even if they do still attach some important muscles. But what about the fact that these pelvic bones in whales differ between males and females? I'm honestly not sure that they do differ, but I'm willing to just say that they do because I can't see why that makes them not vestigial pelvises. Think back to when you were a kid and someone gave you the talk about the birds and the bees. That's probably when you learned where babies come from, and that part of that process is that the infant has to pass through the hips of the female carrying it. For example, here's a picture of a male human pelvis. Look at the hole at the bottom. It's rather narrow. Now, here's a female human pelvis. Notice how the bottom is wider than in the male. That's because the male doesn't have to fit another human the size of a watermelon through the bottom of his pelvis, but the female does.
Fat bottom girls, you make the rockin' world go round.
So, a different pelvic structure for males and females isn't exactly unexpected. Rather, it would be strange if the hips of a mammal weren't a bit sexually dimorphic. Even if the spacing of the hips to accommodate birth in females isn't really an issue for a particular organism, the pelvis is still where muscles for the genitals attach. And since these are of necessity different in different sexes, especially so for mammals, one would expect the pelvises to differ a bit simply to accommodate these muscle attachments. Ironically, it seems that in pointing out the reproductive nature of whale pelvises, Kent has actually given us more evidence that confirms what Evo Devo has taught us about whale pelvises. How's that for a blast from the past?
But then they started doing some more research, and our creator won again. This was actually published in a journal called Evolution. They've now completely blown this out of the water. They're mating reproductive claspers. Whales and dolphins could not breed today unless they have these bony structures to mechanically anchor themselves when they're doing the dance underwater in order to reproduce. No claspers, no babies.
I'm not sure why extinction would be a pillar of evolution. It's just sort of a thing that happens.
According to the Bible, as Pastor talked about last night, we don't need to have a world view, we need to have a word view.
This is completely irrelevant, but it feels weird to use the word pastor as an appellation without an article, when not using it in direct address or with a proper noun. But hey, I'm a descriptivist, and I guess there are registers of English where that works. This isn't even a criticism, just an observation.
If you go through the word view, there's two major extinction events that happen in Scripture. The first one is Noah's flood about 4,400 years ago.
Which didn't happen. See the video above for a deep dive into that.
Everything on earth went extinct except those creatures that were on the ark.
At least Dan's not pretending that all the bugs would be just fine. Kudos to you, Dan.
And then after the flood, and I wish I had more time to cover this, you can remember the acronym HEAT, H-E-A-T. After the flood, with all this tectonic activity that began, like Scripture said, the fountains of the great deep burst open, that created hot oceans, which created E for evaporation, and then we have aerosols from all the volcanoes blowing up from subduction-related tectonic or volcanic activity, and these aerosols block the sun, creating a perfect condition for the one single ice age that we had.
Well, since the flood didn't happen, and it's in flat Earth territory in terms of plausibility, it can't be an explanation for any ice age. But I do think it's important to note that this means that after the Ark, we only have about 300 years to reach Ice Age biodiversity, which is greater than current biodiversity. So let's keep that in mind anytime we think that young Earth creationists have 6,000 years or so to reach modern diversity. They, in fact, have a 20th of that time to reach even higher diversity.
Two major extinction events, and let's see if we can have the video play on this one. Let's see if we can grab some sound, and then we'll wrap up.
Evolution holds that dinosaurs evolved 220 million years ago and died about 65 million years ago from any of a number of possible extinction events. But the Bible teaches that all land animals, including dinosaurs, were created on the sixth day of creation, just thousands of years ago.
Either the Bible isn't really teaching that, or it's wrong. I don't care which option you choose, but those are the only options available to us.
And they were all named by Adam just before God handed over his completed creation to Adam and Eve.
There isn't enough time in a day to name all the animals. Sorry. This also is impossible as an actual event, just like the flood.
Then, about 4,300 years ago, the entire world was deluged by Noah's flood.
Something the pre-existing Egyptian civilization managed to survive just fine. In fact, so well that they found the flood so unremarkable they didn't even mention it in their history or mythology.
And the dinosaurs, along with billions of other creatures, were wiped out. Let's take a quick look at some evidences that show that the biblical account might actually be true. First, dinosaurs are cleverly designed. Consider this Triceratops. Its 2,000-pound head is mounted in a way that allows it to turn every which way, yet still be strong enough to ram something, even while running.
Okay.
What about massive sauropods with weight-bearing systems from hip to toe that allow its 200,000-pound body to even walk, and neck vertebrae that are 90% filled with air so it can lift up its head?
What about them is that they're cool.
Next, there's the absence of dinosaur ancestors and transitions.
Whoop, except that those things aren't absent. We have not quite dinosaurs like Ligurpitids and Silosaurs. We have transitions within Dinosauria, like the Protoceratopsid, Coelosaurus, the prosauropod grade dinosaurs, etc., etc.
Even the Chicago Field Museum sign admits there have been 0 transitions between dinosaur kinds.
No, it doesn't. What it's doing is not putting down taxa at the nodes of a phylogenetic tree, because that's not how you build those. I'm sorry that science doesn't work the way Dan wants it to, but that's just how it is.
It shows question marks regarding where they came from.
No, it doesn't. It shows unlabeled nodes. That's not a question mark or an indication of lack of information.
It's almost like someone just put each basic kind on Earth right at the same time.
Again, no, it's not. Because as I've mentioned, we have a whole host of organisms leading up to Dinosauria and even more within, showing the morphological changes of lineages within the group.
There are even dinosaur design features that show they lived in the ideal pre-flood world. Sauropods can exceed 200,000 pounds, yet they have tiny nostrils for breathing.
And they had extremely efficient bird-like respiratory systems, which helps demonstrate that birds are dinosaurs, as well as help explain why sauropods didn't need exceedingly high oxygen levels to maintain themselves.
Pterodactyls may have been too heavy to fly in today's atmosphere.
But they were not. In fact, they are lighter than birds given the same body volume. If anything, pterosaurs, as they are properly called, were more highly adapted flyers than birds, and could fly just fine if they were to time travel to the modern day. Also, they're not dinosaurs, so we're off topic.
Same with huge pre-flood dragonflies. The fossil record is filled with giant creatures and plants.
Those are griffin flies, not dragonflies. But they also existed long before the dinosaurs, when there was in fact a lot more oxygen in the air during the Carboniferous. And yes, these animals wouldn't likely manage to survive today's relatively low oxygen air, but also the oxygen levels had dropped off by the time of the dinosaurs.
We know this because there are billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the Earth.
What about the fossils in rock layers that were not laid down by water? Because that happens too. Subaerial deposition is real, and subaerial rocks have fossils in many cases.
And when we look at the dinosaur fossil record, we see that they were buried furiously, rapidly, and simultaneously, oftentimes found fleeing in groups.
Sometimes, but also sometimes not. Many dinosaurs were buried in slow-moving or even still water, like the fossils in the Solnhofen limestone.
Take this massive bone bed in Hilda, Canada. Thousands of centrosaurs were catastrophically buried over an entire square mile.
Well, it's 14 centrosaurs, not thousands. And it is a flood deposit, and, no one contests that floods do occur. But let's take the Jakota Formation of Mongolia, where the famous fighting dinosaurs were discovered. It's an Aeolian sandstone, meaning it was deposited by wind under air, not water. Good luck explaining that one with a flood.
Or this one in China, where thousands of different kinds of dinosaurs were simultaneously buried in a single 980-foot-long ravine.
I would check, but the narrator didn't tell me what the formation is, so I can't.
There are hundreds of dinosaur bone beds all over the world, including the US, where the Morrison Formation covers 13 states and 700,000 square miles.
And basically none of it is flood deposits.
Thousands of torn-apart dinosaurs are buried here in hundreds of mass graves, with many found in the classic death pose with their necks arched back, choking as they died.
Were they torn apart and shredded, or were they articulated and in the death pose? Those can't both be true about the same fossil. But that is not a perimortem pose, it's a postmortem pose that is acquired as the tendons tighten after death, and it can be produced in modern dinosaurs by letting them decay in water.
Museum signs everywhere even admit they died in a watery catastrophe.
Well, some of them did, because floods happen.
Some dinosaurs are even found mummified, with tree leaves, flowers, ferns, shrubs, and algae still in their stomach.
Okay, so careful, nearly perfect preservation is what happens in a flood. But so is the animal getting shredded and torn apart. Man, this is a weird flood. In fact, neither is usually a direct result of a single flood. The shredding effect usually happens as a secondary flood after animals are already rotting for months, or years after another flood, and then their remains are washed into a new location and settle into a graded bone bed. In terms of exceptional preservation, it's almost always a result of a slow deposition in an anoxic environment, basically the exact opposite of a flood.
Dinosaurs are even found buried with marine creatures. Isn't a global flood the best explanation for this?
No, because rivers carry corpses out to sea routinely. No flood required.
Scientists have been discovering soft tissue in dinosaur bones. They describe blood cells, blood vessels, connective tissue, and even collagen, which has a maximum shelf life of about 900,000 years at 40 degrees.
But in the proper conditions, it can last as a molecular fossil more or less indefinitely.
With a maximum shelf life of less than 1 million years, what's collagen doing in dinosaur bones that are supposedly 65 million years old?
It has a longer shelf life. Problem solved. I mean, either that or known preservation mechanisms for collagen are fake, and so is basically all of chemistry and physics. I think the more likely explanation is that science is right, collagen can last more or less forever in the right conditions, and the Earth is old, rather than that all of science is just completely wrong.
Many dinosaur bones are even found unfossilized in places like Madagascar, Alaska, and Montana.
But it's not even really clear what they mean by unfossilized, since there are many ways things become fossilized, and they don't specify what they mean.
Does this evidence seem to support the Bible's recent and violent flood, or evolution stories?
It supports evolution completely and unequivocally. But that's it. That's the last argument in the presentation. Thank you everyone for watching. Please do remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And also make sure to use the bell icon and turn on all notifications so you're always notified when there's more Dapper Dino content. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. I just want to take a second to thank my channel members and patrons, especially those pledging $20 and above. Bob Knob, Benthoven, Ian Chen, Sphincter of Doom, The Venerable Bede, Patrick Dennis, and Res Instance. My channel members and patrons help make this channel possible, and without their support, this channel really wouldn't exist. If you would like to help support the channel as a member or patron, there are links in the description to both join the channel as well as join the Patreon. Patrons and members get mentioned in these credit scenes, as well as getting early access to my scripted videos, and if you pledge $10 or above, you can also get access to various 3D assets that I create for Blender, both for use in the channel, as well as just general giveaways to my supporters to help in any Blender projects they might have. If a monthly or annual pledge isn't for you, then there is also a merch store linked in the description, and if none of that's right for you, please just like and subscribe because every like and subscription really helps the video out. Thank you.